Hello everyone. Welcome back to another video and part of our thrilling story. What if Deku was Muzan? If you enjoy it, please like, subscribe and support the original writer Deathly Jazz Hands 55. Now let's dive in. Come again. Izuku called out as yet another customer left the McDonald's building he subjected himself to. The more he stood behind the counter, the more he felt as if his time was being wasted. Unfortunately for the Demon King, he had no real choice but to keep up the act. For as much as he disliked being bossed around by a middle-aged man in a tuxedo, it was his only real way of making money. Legally, that was. A few days ago, he had a meeting with his fellow demons. Ever since then, he hadn't heard from them, but he knew they were still alive. Otherwise, he would have felt their connection to him shatter, just like what happened to Ito. A frown found itself marring his expression as he thought back to the waste of life that was Ito. Ito was a decently strong demon. One that didn't get enough time in the spotlight. Had Bakugo actually been the one to kill him? Or perhaps was it someone else? He knew Bakugo had no possible way of knowing or having a Nichiren blade, so it had to be someone else. The metal that was used to create Nichiren blades was formed within volcanoes and spewed out during an eruption. It was what the original Muzan's memories had told him. It was a metal known as, well, Nichiren. The Demon Slayer Corp had a monopoly over it. But ever since they disappeared, the metal had all but disappeared with them. So, that begged the question, who else had a Nichiren blade? Or, perhaps a better question, how could there still be a Nichiren blade? Demons were viewed as nothing but folklore, even back then. So how would someone know that demons needed to be killed via a Nichiren blade? Things to consider in the future then, Izuku thought, tapping his fingers in a rhythm on the countertop. School had been interesting, all things considered. Everyone was mourning the deaths of the Tsukachi family, and the one who was hit by it the most was a girl named Reiko Yanagi. He considered for a moment turning her into a demon so the two friends could reunite, but he decided against it. The last thing that he wanted Mikon to get was distracted by her best friend. As uplifting as that probably would be for his girlfriend, he shuddered thinking about having a romantic partner. To begin with, he had manipulated her into being his, so he might as well go with it. He also knew that it would ultimately make things worse. That, and he already had another demon in mind. He had heard whispers from people in the streets that they were in town. And seeing as that was the case, he was going to work at trying to find them. Unfortunately, he was going to have to wait to find them, seeing as he had to come up with a plan to find them. They were known to be elusive, so much so that the authorities haven't been able to find them for nearly a decade. However, when they were found, he would be ecstatic. But, that was for later. Right now, he had better things to be doing right now. Such as going to kick the man in the corner out of the restaurant. He had been sitting in the booth there for hours, in a spot where the sunlight wouldn't reach. The man was wearing a traditional white and gray haori. Underneath the haori was a white shirt, and he also, for some reason, wore a pair of hakama pants. Perhaps he was with Yorai Musha? That was what he thought, anyway. His face was fairly pale, and his eyes were a shade of purplish green. A strange combination for sure, but he had seen weirder with the likes of one Ashido Mina who had been in his art class at school. Quite the loudmouth, that one. And one that would not make for a great demon. She seemed too outgoing and would probably wind up much like Ochako Uraraka. That was the last thing he wanted, another Ochako Uraraka who would constantly argue with him. That wasn't even going on about the woman's attitude. Very, very annoying, Ashido Mina was. That was why he actively looked to avoid her. Moving that aside, Izuku walked out from behind the counter and made his way toward the mystery man. He stood beside him, blocking his view of the window as the man glanced up at him. It was then that Izuku noticed that the man was carrying a sword, concealed under his haori. Izuku couldn't have seen it at the angle he had been observing him, but now that he saw it, he came to the conclusion that this man had to have been with Yorai Musha. After all, he was the only one that used swords nowadays. The hilt of the sword was black, with silver diamonds fitting into it, while the guard was that of a blue flower mimicking that of the blue spider lily. It was quite a beautiful sword, and obviously, it was a custom-made one. He could appreciate the sword just by looking at it, although for some reason it made him shiver ever so slightly. "Excuse me, sir," Izuku started, ignoring the chill that had clawed up his back, "but I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The store's policy states that a customer must purchase something 200 yen or more to continue to be here." "Then I'll buy a can of cola," the man responded curtly, fishing out 2 100 yen coins before placing them on the table. Izuku blinked. Was he here for a reason? Had Yorai stationed him to be a part of a mission? That was a possibility. Still, it was odd that the man wanted to stay here. Very well then, one can of cola coming up. Is there anything else I can get you? Izuku asked, using his company-friendly voice as the man narrowed his eyes at him. It was oddly hostile, and a part of him was starting to get slightly unnerved by it. It was the kind of stare of someone who was deciding whether or not it would be worth their time to kill someone. Granted, Izuku knew that he was safe from that. His regeneration made him, quite frankly, undefeatable. His blood was toxic enough that it could kill anyone that didn't acclimate to it. And if he didn't do that, he had strength comparable to All Might. At least, he thought so anyway. He hadn't had an excuse to unleash it yet. So he didn't really know if he did or not. Either way, he was confident that he could probably beat anyone who crossed his path. And so, with narrowed eyes of his own, he spoke again. Sir, is there anything else I can get you? Yes, there is, actually. Once you bring me my cola, I want to talk to you. I need to know whether or not I need to kill you, Demon King Kibutsuji Muzan. For a split second, Izuku was filled with an inhuman amount of rage. How does this human know that? Izuku thought, his teeth baring as he felt a snarl bubble up from his throat and escape him. But, after a second or so of thinking it through, he sighed, calming himself as a wave of controlled anger blanketed him. Keep calm, Izuku. Do not let this inferior individual get into your head. While it is concerning that he knows what I am, perhaps I can dissuade them from doing anything too irrational, and perhaps he can tell me who killed Ito, assuming this person wasn't the one who did it, Izuku rationalized, a smirk taking up his visage. Yes, this will benefit me in the end, it seems. Very well. Give me a moment while I get your cola for you. In fact, Izuku fetched the 2 100-yen coins and placed them back on the table. I believe I'll give you a discount, sir. You can have this one on the house. My treat, the Demon King stated as the man raised an eyebrow. Before the man could say anything, Izuku retreated to fetch the man his cola. Walking behind the counter, Izuku made his way to the fridge in the back. Opening the cooler, he took out a bottle of Coca-Cola, before closing the cooler and opening the freezer. There, in the freezer door, was an icebox. The green and black-haired teen put the cola in the icebox for a few seconds before pulling it out. Now, the drink was cooler than it was before. Closing the freezer, cola in hand, Izuku walked back to the swordsman and sat in front of him, sliding the cola to the man. The swordsman opened the bottle, took a swig of the cold beverage, then put the lid back on. Thank you, the man said curtly as he shifted his hand to the hilt of his sword. You take upon yourself the name of the former king. Tell me, how much do you know of the original Muzan? Izuku's eyes narrowed, fingers steepled as he reclined in the booth he sat in. To be honest with you, sir, I only know what I can barely recollect. The only thing I am aware of is his demise, and his ambitions. However, I can assure you, I do not need to follow in his footsteps. After all, I am already immune to the sun, for I was born with immunity. The man's eyes widened, mouth slightly slack. He clamped his jaw shut, hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Born with it? Yes. Is that an issue, sir? Izuku asked, his tone of voice pointed, threatening. If the man so much as even unhooked his sword from his sheath, the man was as good as dead. And perhaps he knew that which was his hand didn't even so much as budge. No. It is shocking though. It means that I do not have to worry about a crazed lunatic. It seems as if you have a good head on your shoulders. Tell me, then, what is your ambition? The man asked as Izuku frowned. My ambition? Izuku asked, eyebrow raised as he stuffed his hands in his pockets. His ambition was to be a villain that overshadowed them all. To go down in history as a tyrant the likes of which would never be rivaled. That was his goal. To be the world's most dangerous villain. However, it wasn't as if he could blurt that out. He couldn't tell this swordsman, who potentially had ties with Yorai Musha, his plans for complete and total global domination. No, he had to feed him a lie. My ambition is rather simple, sir. Izuku began, closing his eyes as he spoke. I simply wish for demons and humans to live in a pseudo-peace. To this, the man blinked, confusion on his face as he raised an eyebrow of his own. I beg your pardon? I know that it sounds redundant, and I know that there are inherent flaws in my dream, what with demons needing to eat humans to survive. But I believe there is a way for it to work. It would take a lot of planning, and a lot of politicking, but it could be achieved, Izuku explained, the lie effortlessly slipping through his teeth as he enhanced its believability using silver tongue. I'm not out to commit acts of evil. The only people who need to fear me are those who are evil, and are begging for death. Then what of the families who have died? What of Masaru Bakugo? What of Kaneki family? What of those 2 children who were found brutally mauled? What of the handful of homeless people who were torn into pieces and feasted upon? What of the Tsukachi family? What was the MCPD? Were they evil? Did they deserve those deaths? The man interrogated, eyes narrowed as the man seethed in rage. Izuku's frown deepened, body language relaxed as he lowered his head to a threatening degree. Those were not my doing. If I were to guess? Those were the results of the demons I have created. I will rein them in, and make sure nothing like that happens again. Rest assured, sir, that it was not my doing. A likely story, the man spat. And in that split second, his sword clicked. Izuku sighed. It wasn't as if he wanted to kill this man, but it appeared as if he wasn't being given a choice. In the blink of an eye, one of his bone whips launched out from his back and rocketed toward the man sitting across from him. However, in an equally as fast movement, the man drew his sword and parried the blow. Izuku's eyes narrowed. Now this was going to be fun, wasn't it? 2 more of his bone whips launched forward, and in a clean swing, the man sliced the one he had parried off of its root, cutting away the other 2 whips that had formed. Water breathing. First form, water surface slash. The man crossed his arms together, both hands clasping the hilt of his sword as he swung vertically, aiming to slice across his left breast, which had been where one of his brains had been. Thinking quickly, before the blade made contact, he shifted where the brain had been and moved it to his left elbow as the Nichiren sword dug into his flesh. The wound burned unlike any kind of pain that Izuku had felt before, and that was something he hadn't felt since he was run over by that truck all those years back. The Demon King jumped back a foot or 2, standing directly underneath the sun. Strangely, the swordsman didn't move from where he stood, he simply stared. At that point, Izuku put 2 and 2 together. Oh! I see, you're one of the demons of the old era. Ah, that makes sense. Now I understand. That is why you knew who I was, you're a demon. What is your name, comrade? Do not call me that, the man snarled, resheathing his blade as he got in a lunging stance, eyes drilling into his soul as Izuku got in a retreating stance. The Demon King had no idea what he was doing, but it was made clear as day when he slapped a tag on his forehead that read, Sunlight Shield. Thunder breathing. First form, thunderclap and flash. The table shattered under the swordsman's lunge, and before Izuku could react, his upper body had been disconnected from his lower body. Izuku's eyes widened as the swordsman landed feet first on the wall, resheathing his sword as he lunged forward yet again. Twofold. Yet again, in a blinding motion, the swordsman slashed at him, this time his right arm which had been connected at the shoulder was cut off. The pain was searing and as the swordsman reorientated himself to land on the wall yet again, Izuku narrowed his eyes. Fleshy tendrils reconnected his cut-off limbs and upper body, his regeneration sealing the wounds shut as blood coated the floor. Yet again, the swordsman lunged forward. Threefold, the man roared, aiming for his neck. Snapping his fingers, spikes created out of his blood launched forth, creating a makeshift shield. He had made them as hard as stone, as a way to actually protect himself, even if it was only for a brief second, all the while he dodged out of the way. The Nichiren sword cut through the rock-like spikes, Izuku nowhere in his sight as the swordsman growled. The tag on his forehead was slowly burning away. By the rate it was burning, it would fully fade away in 3 minutes. Izuku had to admit, he had been completely caught off guard. Hence why he had ducked behind the fridge. His eyes glowed a violent red as his fingertips sharpened into claws. The residual burning feeling from the slash and gashes was irritating, and if he had to guess, it would be like how the sun burning his body would feel, but on a far more painful level. This must be what a demon slayer was like. I have to admit, they are annoying. And, if I were to guess, this was the man who killed Ito. To think that a fellow demon would kill another demon. Then again, this demon had lived under the rule of the original Muzan Kibutsuji. As Izuku's thought finished, he blinked, and the man had been in front of him, arms arched back with his hands firmly gripping the hilt of his sword as he growled. Water breathing. Third form, flowing dance. Bending his whole body to the right, the swordsman demon slashed horizontally, aiming for his neck as Izuku frowned. He had been working on this particular attack for a little while, all in the privacy of his house, and out of the way of everyone. Now, he had a chance to use it. And so, that was exactly what he was going to do. He could finally put his blood demon art to use. Blood demon art, biokinesis, solar flare. White fire burst forth from his arm as he protected his neck from the slash. The sword bathed in flames as the swordsman demon's eyes widened. The blade dug into the skin of the Demon King, ripping through with ease. And yet, despite that, his flesh healed as the blade tore through his arm. In a swinging motion, Izuku caused a swath of flame to eject forward in an arc. The wave of flame cut through the demon swordsman from the waist down, singing the wounds as the man grit his teeth. The flame wave disappeared before it could cut through anything else in the room, as he hadn't wanted to destroy the building he was in. That would only lead to disaster. Despite the pain the man must have been in, he regenerated almost immediately, his former pair of legs disintegrating in the sunlight. He no longer had a pair of pants on, but the man hadn't regenerated his lower half with genitals, so at the very least Izuku didn't have to look at it. Not that the man would be alive for much longer, anyway. Now, he was in grabbing range. And because of that, this fight was basically over. In the man's dazed confusion, Izuku lunged forward, grabbing the demon by the head as he stabbed his fingers into the man's skull, a sneer taking up his visage. Blood demon art, biokinesis, mummification. By impaling the demon's skull, his hand began pumping his blood into the demon, linking the demon to him via his blood. Thusly, he was able to use his blood demon art on him. The man practically shrunk like a raisin, his body atrophying in a matter of seconds. The sword clambered out of his hand and onto the ground. Izuku tossed the demon to the ground, before picking up the man's Nichiren blade. It was a nice, calming violet blade. The kind of blade that someone with a calm mind would use. Not this pathetic whelp of a man. The Demon King smirked, walking over to the demon, who tried to move. His body was dried out to the point that moving was impossible. He might as well have been a turtle stuck on their back. I'll give you this, comrade, you were the first person to have actually put up a fight against me. Die knowing that you were the first real opponent to the new king of the demons, Izuku stated, putting the sharp edge of the blade to the demon's neck. I heard all demons go to hell, and if that is the case, then I am truly sorry. But considering you are so old, I'm sure you'd like to go to an afterlife. Tell the other demons that have died that they will be remembered. Oh, and one more thing, tell Ito I said hello. With a quick, precise slash, Izuku decapitated the demon. His body faded away, and yet, instead of a pained expression, the man simply smiled. The man said nothing. He had no last words as his body turned into dust, leaving behind his haori and shirt. Izuku stood over the clothing, dropping the sword on the heap of clothes. Rolling his neck from side to side, Izuku couldn't help but feel a little bit disheartened. To see a relic of an old era die, and to die with the knowledge he had. Knowledge he could have used. If only he hadn't posed a threat to Izuku, he probably wouldn't have killed him. He also probably wouldn't have killed him if he hadn't been another Uraraka, i.e. in the sense of being a defiant demon who would cause more problems than help. May you rest in peace, if that is even possible for a demon. And with that, Izuku left his shift early that day, but not before reporting the attack as a villain attack. His manager was a little annoyed that he left early but understood because of the villain's attack. And now, with his afternoon completely free, he had planned to go pick up Eri from the daycare he had dropped her off at. Keyword being, planned. As he had been interrupted from doing that by someone tapping him on the shoulder. Looking over his shoulder, he was met with a man made entirely out of purplish black mist with piercing, slanted, yellow eyes. He wore a butler's attire, that being a black waistcoat, a gray button-down shirt, green and yellow striped pants, and black shoes. Before Izuku could say anything, the man created a portal out of thin air made out of the same mist, before bowing as he spoke. I am running off of an assumption, but if you are the rumored hero cannibal, then my boss would like to have a word with you. I am confident that after what I have seen to be the case. And thusly, I would like to inform you that he is interested in speaking to you. Instead of being enraged, Izuku merely sighed. How this man knew what he was, while important, would have to wait. And, apparently, as would his pickup of Eri. He knew that if he didn't go that this man's boss would most likely spread the knowledge that he, Muzan Kibutsuji, were the hero cannibal, instead of allowing his persona of Izumi Sugimoto to be that. Very well. Then let us depart. Izuku stepped through the portal, and he, along with the man made entirely out of mist, disappeared from sight. Not that anyone had been on the street, in the first place. Bakugo stood at the entrance of UA High School with a frown. His hands clenched into fists, barely contained anxiety following through his body. This was it, he was here. He wasn't a student yet, but he was going to be one. That much he knew. He hadn't trained with his quirk for all of his life to just be turned away. And yet, despite his confidence in that regard, he couldn't get Ito's face out of his mind. He had been a completely different creature. He wasn't human, but according to the man who had saved his life, he was something known as a demon. And if he could harbor a guess, so was that brown-haired woman. They both had been demons. Maniating demons. Flesh-devouring, bone-crunching, monstrous demons. The kinds of things he had heard in folklore. They were real, and if he had to guess, those books he had read as a kid about demons, such as the one written by Kiriya Ubuyashiki titled, Demon Slayers, The Hunt for the King, wasn't just a story. It was labeled as fiction, and it told the story of a group of 3 brave demon slayers who started with humble beginnings. Tanjiro Kamado, a country bumpkin who lived in the mountains with his family. Unaware to himself and everyone around him, his family had been the last known people to use the Hinakami Kagura, aka, something called sun-breathing. Inosuke Hashibara, a man raised in the wilderness, supposedly by a pack of wild boars, and created his own breathing style without any real knowledge of them prior to becoming a demon slayer. And Zenitsu Agatsuma, an orphan who lived with one of the cultivators of the breathing styles that they used to slay demons, specifically thunder breathing. All of them shared one thing in common, and that was how their lives had been adversely affected by demons. Tanjiro lost his family to them, Inosuke's mother was eaten by one titled Upper Moon 2, Doma, and Zenitsu was betrayed by a fellow demon slayer who had become Upper Moon 6, Kaigaku. Another thing they shared in common was that they were the ones who ultimately killed the Demon King, Muzan Kibutsuji. At the end of the book, as a little author's note, there was a eulogy for all of those who died in the fight against Muzan. He had always found it strange that there was a eulogy for a bunch of fictional characters. But now that he had encountered a demon, he now understood why there had been one. Because the characters hadn't been characters. They had been real people. Real people who had been actually affected by the Demon King, Muzan. But seeing as the Demon King was dead, how could there be demons now? Those who had been connected to Muzan died when he died. Unless, of course, there was a new Demon King. And if that was the case. Don't think about that, you have an exam to do, Bakugo thought, teeth clenched as he walked through the gates of UA High School. He was wearing a winter coat, as it was still really cold, despite it being the last week of March. You'd think it wouldn't be so cold, and yet it was, which was a little on the annoying side. He ignored everyone. He ignored the whispers and the gossip. Everyone knew about what happened both with the sludge villain a few months ago, and also with the incident at the apartment complex a week back. Both of them involved him, and that had no doubt garnered him a reputation. A reputation he didn't want. God, the younger him would chew the current him up and spit him out. He would have called himself pathetic, a waste of air. But at the same time, the younger version of him hadn't felt the loss of Auntie Inko, the supposed death of his major bullying victim, and neither had he gone up against a demon. He would always wear the scars of that battle on his body as a reminder that there were stronger, far more dangerous entities out there. Entering the building, Katsuki was directed to the stadium on the school grounds by a scrawny man wearing a strange, mole-like metal helmet. He didn't question the strange get-up, but considering the man was a pro-hero, it was probably their costume. It looked stupid, but who he was to judge? The future costume that he had designed was going to have massive fuck-off grenades on his forearms. It didn't take long to find where he needed to go, seeing as everyone who was entering the building was going there. He funneled into a room filled with desks, which had confused him. It was then that he realized that he had completely forgotten about the written portion of the exam. To make a very long and boring hour of his life short, he fucking aced it. The more exciting part came in when he got taken to the location where the practical exam would be taking place. The stadium itself was large, nearly as large as the Rungrado 1st of May Stadium in the defunct nation of North Korea, now joined with South Korea and renamed the Socialist Democratic Republic of Korea. The UA Stadium could reportedly hold 156,000 spectators, making it just barely larger than the aforementioned Rungrado Stadium. Prior to being seated, the blonde had been given the chance to change into his tracksuit, which had been a standard blue zip-up two-piece tracksuit. After he had gotten changed, Katsuki had been seated in the 20th row, which had been directly in the middle of the stadium, and given the tag of Participant 4405. By the dozens other participants filled in the seats around him, most walking in pairs, talking about their potential futures in the world of heroics. Katsuki only focused on his thoughts. He had a game plan, as after doing some minor research about the entrance exam, it was rumored to be destroying robots. So, his plan was simple: destroy every robot he could see. Overall, it was a rather straightforward plan. The kind of plan the old him would have reveled in. Of course, current-day him liked the plan, but not nearly as much as the old Katsuki would. After a few moments passed, a rather strange-looking man walked onto the stage. The only reason why Katsuki could see what was going on was because of the jumbotron hanging just above the stadium. On the stage was a man with electric blonde hair, piss-yellow tinted sunglasses, a paintbrush-tip mustache, and a massive boombox neck brace. His outfit was a black leather jacket with a high-rise collar fitted with silver studs. The jacket had brown protection pads on its shoulders, and underneath the jacket, the man wore a white tank top. The man, who Katsuki was assuming now to be a pro hero, was wearing a pair of black jeans, which was held up by a belt with a golden belt buckle. Finally, for accessories, he wore a pair of boots that rode up to halfway up his lower leg, along with a pair of fingerless gloves. The pro hero in question cleared his throat, and, without the use of a microphone, began to speak. And despite the lack of a microphone, even from the 20th row in the stadium, Katsuki could hear him as clear as day. "Welcome to today's live performance. Everybody say, hey!" the man shouted, almost making the explosive blonde cover his ears. After a moment of awkward silence, the man on the stage, who most likely had some kind of voice-related quirk, mumbled something to the effect of "tough crowd" under his breath. In all honesty, Katsuki was amazed that he could still hear that. Ever confident, the pro hero cleared his throat and continued. "Well, that's cool, my examinee listeners. I'm here to present the guidelines for your practical exam. Are you ready?" Yet again, the pro hero was met with deafening silence. This guy's gotta have the confidence of a god to keep going after 2 rows of awkward silence. Katsuki thought as the pro hero continued his explanation. "This is how the test will go, my listeners. You'll be experiencing 10-minute-long mock cityscape maneuvers. Bring along whatever you want. After this presentation, you'll each head to your assigned testing location. Okay." Yet again, more silence. The pro hero continued, undeterred. "Each site is filled with 3 kinds of faux villains. Points are awarded for each according to their respective difficulty levels. 1 point for common faux villains, 2 points for challenging faux villains, and 3 points for ludicrous faux villains. Use your quirks to disable these faux villains. And earn points. That's your goal, listeners. Oh, as per exam policy, playing the antihero and attacking other examinees. That'll net you a disqualification and blacklist from UA." Before the presenter could continue, a boy with blue stood up from the crowd, holding what appeared to be a handout. And when he stood up, adjusting his glasses in the process, he spoke. "Excuse me, I hate to interrupt, but there appear to be no fewer than 4 varieties of faux villains on this handout. Such a blatant error, if it is one, is highly unbecoming for UA, Japan's top academy." And then, suddenly, the blue-haired teen turned to face where Katsuki had been sitting, though he wasn't looking in the direction of Katsuki, but rather a seat or 2 higher than him. "And you there? The one with the purple hair and earphone jack quirk. Why would you bring 2 massive swords into the exam? I hope you have a permit to carry those." Katsuki turned around, craning his neck up to see a thin-looking girl. She was sitting in a crisscross position, arms lazily draped across her legs as she sat hunched over. She was wearing a casual purple shirt with the words "Deep Dope" written in English across the chest of her shirt, and she was wearing a pair of black ripped jeans. She also had a dark blue biker's vest over her shoulders, and on her back were 2 club-like hilts connected to one another by a chain. Upon further inspection, the girl's arms were rather muscular, if not lean. The kind of physical strength that she had to effectively wield those blades had to be immense. Despite her small size, it was clear as day that, regardless of her appearance, if those weapons were indeed swords, and if they were as big as Katsuki had been assuming them to be, she was guaranteed to be a major threat to all of those in her path. Her expression was neutral, with not a single ounce of offense on her face as she waved the boy off. "Relax, stickler. I got a permit, and I registered it at the front desk," the girl replied as the teen bowed, apologizing, before turning back to face the front. All right. Examinee 7111, nice catch, thanks. But the 4th faux villain variety gets you 0 points. It's more of an obstacle. To make a better example, have any of y'all played Super Mario Bros? Can't blame ya if you hadn't, that series is ancient. See, the fourth variety of faux villain is kinda like a thwomp. There's only one at each site. A gimmick that'll rampage around in the final quarter. The pro hero explained as the blue-haired teen bowed. Got it, so it's like a stage gimmick to be avoided. Thank you, sir, I apologize for the interruption. The overtly pretentious teen said as Katsuki frowned. He hated those kinds of people the most. They always got on his nerves, especially when they acted holier than thou. At least this guy had the nerve to apologize when he was wrong. Apology accepted. And now, that's all from M. I'll leave my listeners with our school motto. The great hero, whose name takes after a historical figure, Napoleon Bonaparte once said, "True heroism consists in being superior to the ills of life." Plus ultra. Break a leg, everyone. With that, everyone filtered out of their seats. When Katsuki got to the exit door, he was provided with a piece of paper that gave him the number of which field he would be taken to, his specifically being field 3. Afterward, he was told which direction to go to get to the bus that he would be riding to get to the field. He asked why he had to take a bus, to which he was told that it was because of the distance they were spread out on the school's campus. Katsuki had to admit it was a little daunting. UA's campus had to be rather large for him to have to take a bus to the location in question. Once he boarded the bus, he took his seat, which was at the very back. He had picked to sit there to be by himself, but, as luck would have it, that wasn't happening, as not even a second later the girl with the large swords on her back sat down right next to him. The two shared a passing glance, which earned him a peace sign being flashed at him before she returned to doing whatever it was she was doing. Katsuki looked out the window as the bus began to pull out. There was a bunch of chattering going on, none of which he was paying attention to. Out of the corner of his eye, the girl took out her two swords, and just as he had assumed, they were freaking huge. Each sword had to have weighed at least 30 pounds, and despite that, she was holding them with no effort. Not even a single bead of sweat had appeared on her forehead. They were bandaged with some kind of wrap, the blades, anyway. The hilt was a bright red with golden studs at the ends, both of which had a chain connecting them as if they were nunchucks. Within the hilt were lime-green diamond-like shapes, and the guard of the blades a brilliant gold color. From where the end of the blade met the guard 4 red lines were going out in each direction of the guard, and the ridge of the guard was a lime green much like the diamond-like shapes in the hilt. Then, came the blade itself. They were huge, easily about the size of the girl's arms in length. Strangely, each blade had a large circle-like hole just by the rear of the blade. And while he would have liked to see the color of the blade, they had been bandaged, so it wasn't like he could see them. The purple-haired held the two blades in front of her, muttering something under her breath, almost like a prayer. Her eyes were closed, and her head was lowered. From what Katsuki could catch, she was muttering some kind of prayer of thanks. She didn't know if it was either to a god or an ancestor. Either way, it hardly mattered to Katsuki. When the girl reopened her eyes, Katsuki looked away as the girl placed the swords back where they had been, i.e. on the girl's back. He noticed that they had been kept in place by two holders that had been stitched onto the jacket. They must have been made out of something really strong if they were able to keep the swords in place. After a few more minutes, the bus stopped at their location. Everyone filtered off of the bus in a single-file line, with Katsuki being the last one off. By the time he got off, he had been surprised to see that the pro hero who had done the presentation hadn't been kidding when he had said cityscape maneuvers. Because, and he wished he had been joking, the testing field was a literal cityscape. The sheer absurdity of that sentence made Katsuki want to flinch. What was even more absurd was the fact that there were multiple cityscapes across the campus of UA, and that was just a portion of the campus. The sites were separated by large swaths of forest, and that alone showed just the kind of budget they had. The walls surrounding the cityscape were fucking massive. He couldn't even see over them even if he tried. Even if he had used his quirk, his arms would buckle under pressure before he could make it to the top. And, from what he could see, the cityscape went on for miles. There was more than enough room for over 200 attendees, and upon looking around him, he noticed that multiple buses had been lined up. Shit, just how many of these guys are there? Bakugo thought as he frowned. Whatever the case was, Katsuki was going to make it into the fucking school. He hadn't worked his goddamn ass off and nearly died not once but twice to get this far, only to fail. No matter what the world threw at Katsuki Bakugo, he wouldn't bend to anyone. Not even for a second. If that was one thing his current self and his old self had in common, it was that. Alright, listeners. The voice of the pro hero who had done the presentation had traveled all across the immediate area. It was only then that Katsuki noticed the speaker above the entrance to the cityscape's walls. And speaking of the entrance, it was starting to open. Get going. Come on, don't just stand there, move it, move it, move it. In a real battle, no one waits for a countdown. The die has been cast. And with a smirk on his face, Katsuki threw his arms back, got into a lunging stance, and blasted forward, cutting through the crowd of people before him. He was going to pass this exam. And nothing was going to stop him. The sound of steel cutting through steel filled the streets of the mock city, oil covering the floor as a purple-haired teen slung two giant cleaver-like swords around with ease. The sounds were morbid, screeching and unbearable, and yet, to the swordswoman she didn't seem to care what sound it made. Or, at the very least, she didn't hear the gut-curdling sound of metal on metal, nor the violent tearing and clashing. The way the swordswoman moved, to anyone other than her, looked erratic, messy, and uncaring. The two nunchuck-like cleavers swinging about with careless abandon, treated like toys in a moment where the battle before them should be taken seriously, even if it was an exam, bodily harm was possible. Yet the woman didn't seem to care, or at the very least had no real intentions of putting actual brain power into the idea of getting hurt. The way she moved with mock charges, abrupt stops, kicks, flips and overreaching slashes that would otherwise present a moment of opening to a real opponent, it all felt haphazard. And yet, if one looked closer it was hard to see the actual openings. But most of the people in the exam didn't nor couldn't see it. To the onlookers, it looked as if the swordswoman was having fun. Like she was moving to her own rhythm rather than paying attention to what was actually going on. Rather than moving coherently and dodging out of the way in a normal, regular way like swerving, ducking, or anything like that, she moved with her whole body, and in a way, it was almost hypnotizing. To those who had no idea what it was she was doing, it looked as if she wasn't taking anything seriously. To the other participants, even if the movements were erratic, the teen who was manhandling the swords with such pathetic ease despite their supposed weight, wasn't paying attention to her surroundings. That, however, couldn't have been any more wrong. In fact, she was more in tune with her surroundings than anyone in the immediate area. So much so that, should her father have been watching her, he would have commented on how far she had come since the first day she picked up the two Nichiren cleavers. And on top of all of that, she was, in fact, taking the exam seriously. It just wasn't in the way that most people assumed someone would take something seriously. Because doing that didn't allow for the woman to actually use her skill set to its fullest potential. And to further emphasize that, it only took for someone to actually stop what they were doing, and pay attention to the fight at hand to know that, even if it looked erratic, each foot placement meant something, each movement that the purplet made wasn't just instinctual, but it was pre-planned in advance. The reason for all of this was because of what she was doing. What she had been doing the moment she found herself in this street in the first place. When she saw the absolute amount of robots in the area, her chance to show off everything she learned. She was using a technique. Specifically, she was using something that her father had taught her. And that something being? Sound breathing. Third form, serene grace. In an almost trance-like state, she sidestepped to the right to avoid an oncoming punch from a single-point robot, and then immediately took advantage of the opening it gave to thrust forward with the right blade and impale the foe, after which she jumped, hovering for a split second above the robot before falling with a perfectly timed downward slash meant to cleave through the robot from top to bottom, all before landing perfectly before using whatever remains as a long-ranged weapon to knock down yet another single-point robot behind the ones she dispatched. The moment she set foot onto the ground, she sidestepped to the left, and avoided a handful of small micro-rockets coming just a foot above her, their source being from a two-point robot. Seeing as she couldn't reliably clear the distance in time to deal with the rest of the threats around her, the purplet used her left earphone jack, the fleshy appendage dangling from her earlobes, to plug into the enemy and propel forward her heartbeat, messing with the robot's internals causing it fell to the ground in a heap. This allowed the purplet to take out the other threat that she was now evading multiple attacks from, swerving right to block metallic fists, swiping her left and right blades to deflect missiles which should have destroyed the blades, before seeing the opening given to her by the robot, allowing her to charge forward and jam her left cleaver into a three-point robot's face, deactivating it instantly. From her rear, two more single-point robots tried to jump her, only to miss just by a fraction of a second as she ducked forward, spinning around on her heel to face them. The purple-haired teenager sucked in a breath through the gaps in her now wide toothy grin. Her blood began to pump faster, her muscles tightened and her veins have bulged ever so slightly. She felt like a robot killing machine. The two robots prepared themselves to attack again, seconds away from lunging forward in an attempt to adhere to their programming, but it was of no use as by the time the teenager breathed in, their metallic graves had practically been dug. Raising both of her arms above her head, cleavers in hand as she raised her chin in such a way that her grin looked almost condescending. The gleam in her violet eyes reflected arrogance, and truthfully that was how she felt. Sound breathing, first form, roar. And in the end, she was right to feel arrogant, as she slammed the two cleavers down with a mighty boom. The two robots were diced in half in one swoop, circuits buzzing and oil collecting in puddles around the halved robotic bodies. All of this took place within the span of a handful of seconds, and to the onlookers, it looked like a blur more so than a battle. It was, quite frankly, ridiculous how fast such a frail-looking person could move. Though, she was far from frail. But with a passing glance, you could assume otherwise. What a rush. Heavy metal all the way. Kyoka quipped, exhaling as she rolled her neck from side to side. To her, that was what the whole scene had felt to her. Her hearing was wicked sharp, no doubt boosted by her quirk, earphone jack, which amplified her hearing more than it already would have been without them. It was a trait inherited by her family's bloodline. Or, well, one of them anyway. Her great-great-grandfather was a ladies' man, having 3 wives and all that jazz. The cacophony of sounds that played in her mind when she fought resembled a rock concert. And it wasn't a stretch to say it was a little overdramatic. But, her family was always one for a musical inclination. So, for her, battling was like a concert of her very own. Her father practiced with the swords to honor a tradition. Kyoka practiced with them for future use. Kyoka had racked up a total of 39 points in her 4-minute excursion in the practical exam, and she wasn't done yet. She was hopping from one battle to another, utilizing the total concentration breathing, constant as she ran. Her father had taught her it as it was a staple of the Jairu family, or, more appropriately, the Yuzui bloodline. She didn't know where this particular practice came from, only that sound breathing and the swords that her ancestor used in tandem were somehow connected to it. Ever since she was 6 years old, her father passed down the family training ritual. At first, she believed it to be pointless, that it was just a waste of time. Back then, there was no real reason to practice the rituals. The dances. All of it. To a young Jairu Kyoka, it meant nothing. But as time went on, and as reports of people winding up being eaten slowly came to the surface, they realized that it was important. Her father told her stories that he had heard from his grandfather and Yuzui Tengen before him. Stories of flesh-eating monsters that came out at night. And if that had been what Tenhyojikan had been referring to, then she would do everything in her power to learn what her father was trying to teach her. And so, that was what she did. She even contributed to it by adding a 6th form. She had gotten so invested in that now, she could never see herself parting with her Nichiren cleavers that used to be her ancestors. All of that training. All of that hard work, it was being put to work here. And she was going to do what it took to protect humanity. If demons were really coming back, then she was going to need to step up and make her ancestors proud. If only I was allowed to bring my exploding stars. Ah, whatever, regulations are regulations, I guess. Jairu thought as she passed by large imposing building after large imposing building, heedless of what came her way as she kept the blades at her sides, her grip on their hilts tight so that they wouldn't fly out of her hands, and her pace steady. Her breathing was steady, controlled, and measured. She covered what felt like several feet in a handful of seconds, and by the time she made a sharp left turn down another section of the street, she kicked off forward, spotting a group of single-pointers hoarding around what looked to be a boy with round balls for hair. He cowered, terrified of his surroundings, and yet despite that there were several stuck robots near him. Some 3-pointers, and a few 2-pointers scattered about. Nothing too big. If she added up the amount it would be something like 25-ish points. The kid's head was bleeding, which was most likely because of his ball hair quirk. Regardless of that, Kyoka's grip on her cleavers increased as she lunged forward, narrowing her eyes as she closed the distance between both herself and the group of robots. All of them were still circling the boy, who was still cowering. He could possibly get in the way, but even so, she still had to take down the robots. And so, upon barging in between the group of 5 or so robots, she shifted her grip from the hilts to the chains of the swords. Sound breathing, 5th form, string performance. And thus, there was chaos. The blades flung about in a chaotic, yet also mesmerizing display of personal awareness as she constantly bounced about from robot to robot, ducking and diving between position and position, hacking and slashing everything she came across. The blades hacked and slashed through the metallic flesh of the single-pointers, slicing and chopping their limbs and destroying their circuits all with incredible ease. With each step, in a split second, all of the robots fell apart, oil covering the ground as she ceased the movement of her blades by clamping down on their hilts and moving with them to a grinding halt a few inches away from the boy, who had now been looking at her with a gleam in his eyes. Kyoka looked back at the purple ball-haired teen, flashing him a smile before jetting off to find something else to do. She couldn't keep still. Not when she was in this much of a good mood. There were more robots nearby, and with more robots came more points, and with more points came a higher chance of getting into this school. On the other side of the cityscape, loud booms and bangs tore up the streets as Katsuki blasted apart robot after robot with reckless abandon and a wicked grin plastering his face. With force to knock down structure supports, Bakugo wasted no time in dispatching 5 single-point robots who had been grouped together for some reason or another. This was supposed to be their exam? Seriously? This was pathetically easy. At least, for him. His quirk was good at dispatching enemies with pathetic ease. Sure, he wouldn't use real, lethal force on his enemies like this, but these were robots. He was allowed to go as hard as he was. And yet, in the back of his mind, every time he blew apart one of the robots, he couldn't help but see Ito Kaneki. In the back of his mind, he knew that Ito had become a monster, but that still didn't mean that he felt guilty. Not for blowing him apart about a handful of times. No. Guilt for not continuing to be his friend. Maybe, if Ito had someone to keep him grounded, Ito wouldn't have turned out that way. As the robots fell before him, Bakugo spat on them. He didn't need to think about them that way. These things were machines with no sort of soul. They had no lives outside of being destroyed, so he didn't need to care. He looked up at the scoreboard and saw his name in the first slot. 63 points, just underneath this Jairu Kyoka individual, who had a healthy 43 points. A whole 20 points less. Damn. Bakugo thought, rolling his neck from side to side. His arms were starting to get a little tired. 63 points were good enough. He didn't need to take down any more robots. He knew that was probably more than enough to get into the school. But, at the same time, what if it wasn't? What if he needed more? The blonde shook his head, staring at the ground. He was in first place, he didn't need any more points. Besides, being a hero wasn't just about defeating villains. The old him would have thought that way, but he wasn't that disgrace, now was he? With that in mind, he decided to go look for people who needed help, his expression drawn into a neutral gaze as he jumped upward and propelled himself using his explosions. With each burst of flame and smoke, Katsuki felt his muscles brace the impact, growing more and more tired. But, he had to keep going. A part of him wondered what Midoriya would do. Would he be the same if Midoriya hadn't faked his death? No. No, he probably wouldn't have been. He probably would have blamed Midoriya for what happened to Aunt Inko. Speaking of Midoriya, what is he doing right now? Midoriya had become sort of an enigma. Ever since the death of his father, Midoriya disappeared. His mother was shell-shocked from the event and hadn't left the house in days. Every creaky floorboard, every new sound, and every new sudden movement made, caused his mother to jump and cower in fear. That fucking monster, the monster that killed that shitty bastard, traumatized my mother. I will never forgive her. Katsuki thought as he gritted his teeth, stopping dead in his tracks as several robots, around 6 if he counted correctly, jumped forward from an alleyway. An ambush? These things know how to plan. I mean, that's some pretty advanced programming. Katsuki counted the types of robots. They were 3-pointers and single-pointers, 2 of which were 3-pointers while the rest were single-pointers. Nothing too special but worth adding to his point count. They came to him, after all. Launching himself forward, the robots prepared to fire at him with their plastic bullets and smoke rockets, but before they could fire even one stun grenade, Bakugo's hand came an inch away from the center robot, that being a 3-pointer, as the metal casing of its head caved in, shutting it down. Then, jumping back, Katsuki unleashed yet another explosion to his immediate right, which a single-pointer had started to attack from. Several bullets shot out from his left as he hopped to the right, swinging his whole body into one of the robots, placing a hand on it as he unleashed an explosion, blowing a hole through its core as it shut down. Katsuki avoided a right hook from the 3-pointer, followed by several smoke rockets hurtling toward him. Katsuki shot out an explosion, preemptively detonating the missiles, which seemed to shock the 3-pointer. Using this to his advantage, Katsuki thrust both of his palms forward and eclipsed the rest of the robots with a massive explosion large enough to take up a few feet around the blonde teen. Another 10 points? 73 points. Katsuki thought, looking around him as a golden blonde-haired boy crept out from the alleyway. He had sparkling blue eyes, they were quite literally sparkling, not in a romantic kind of way, golden blonde hair, and a strange belt around his waist with a light blue gem in the center. He was wearing a white shirt with a fluffy V-neck collar, along with a pair of black pants. Merci, monsieur. I was about to be hurt by those things, you saved me. Bon chance with the exam. The strange teen said, running off to find more robots as Bakugo blinked. He understood some of what he said, but not enough to actually respond. Still, a sense of pride for saving the guy. Heh, ain't that a trip? Katsuki continued forward, trying to find something to do as he blew up any robot that came in his line of sight. At some point, around the 7-minute mark, Katsuki felt like he wasn't taking the exam seriously. In all honesty, he would be inclined to agree. He stole a few robot takedowns because the people who were fighting them weren't exactly having the best of time with them, all of which earned him scathing looks and angered shouts. Hey, it wasn't his fault they were failing to take down the robots. And besides, at least they walked away without any damaged or broken bones. In the back of his mind, he thought about how some of these people's quirks were weak. Well, weak for combat anyway. Some of them, like the one with tape elbows, would be good for capturing villains, though. The person with the voice animal summoning quirk was pretty cool, too. Bakugo saw the rock-headed teen control several dogs, mostly German shepherds, and shut down the robots by hitting buttons that were located on the backs of their heads. How he was able to get a bunch of dogs into the building was beyond him, but he found it interesting. Bakugo was leaning against a wall in an alleyway, rolling his shoulder as he sneered. When Ito slammed him against that wall, his shoulder had been completely dislocated, and when the doctors reset it, they told him to make sure that he regularly took pain medication as well as to use his quirk less. The problem with that was that this exam was coming up, and, well, he wasn't going to miss that chance. And now, here he was, 7 minutes into the exam with his shoulder hurting like a motherfucker. He rolled it a few times, trying to get the pain to go away, and all that did was make it slightly worse. On his way to this alleyway, he had assisted a few people by taking down an extra robot they couldn't. One of the guys was a guy with a quirk that made his skin rock hard. The guy's name was Kirishima. Kirishima Aijuru. His hair was a bright red and his eyes were a shade of crimson red, just like Midoriya's. Unlike Midoriya's, his pupils were normal. They were round, not cat-like. Katsuki frowned. Cat-like irises. He remembered that both the girl who murdered his father and kidnapped Eri, and Ito, had cat-like irises. It could have been a complete coincidence, but Midoriya also had cat-like irises. No, you're overthinking things, Katsuki, the blonde bomber thought, shaking his head. He couldn't get Midoriya out of his head. Midoriya's quirk was strange. For the longest time, he thought that his quirk was just cat-like eyes. But now he found out it was shape-shifting. He also had some sort of super strength if what he saw in that alleyway was anything to scoff at. Or, perhaps, he had a weapon on him. What he didn't see. Either way, the fact that his quirk was shape-shifting was a little strange. He never displayed that ability back in elementary school, and he never corrected Katsuki back then either. Why? Was it because he didn't see a need to? Ugh, why am I thinking about him? I should be thinking about the exam, Katsuki frowned as he stood up straight, walking out of the alleyway. Just before he did, someone came rocketing toward him, back facing him as Katsuki switched his stance on a dime, planting himself on the ground as he caught the person. Fuck. The person muttered, getting up as the boy groaned, ran out of time. With that said, the person, a guy, looked over his shoulder as light blue eyes met ruby red. A small smile took up the teen's visage as he spoke. Ah. Thanks for catching the fall, the guy said as explosions popped off in his palm. Bakugo raised an eyebrow as the guy rolled his shoulders. Hope you don't mind if I copy your quirk. It seems pretty powerful. I'm sure with a great quirk like yours you'll make it in. And with it, I hope I can make it as well. The boy was wearing a light yellow jacket over his shoulders, along with a plain black and white striped shirt, coupled with a pair of blue shorts and white knee-length socks. On top of that, he had a stopwatch on his wrist that read, 3 minutes flat, before he tapped the start button, which made it start a rapid countdown. See you in the UA. And just like that, he left. Bakugo blinked, confusion taking up his mind as he sighed. That was interesting, Bakugo muttered. He couldn't help but note that he was running into a lot of people with either decent or powerful quirks. I guess UA attracts the best of the best for a reason. Bakugo thought, biting his tongue. It was around that time when the ground began to shake, and Bakugo looked up, only to see a giant hand grip the side of the building that he had been hiding between. Fuck me, this is the big guy, ain't it? Bakugo ran out of the alleyway the moment he realized that, and he was lucky that he did, as a massive chunk of buildings came crashing down in the alleyway that he had been relaxing in. If he hadn't moved any sooner. Jesus Christ! Are they trying to get someone killed? Bakugo's mind roared as he looked up at the towering beast of a machine. It was in the street opposite to the one he was in, but by God that did not stop him from seeing the freakishly huge titan. It easily loomed over any building that he was near, standing at least 9 stories tall. It was colored bright green, and it had a giant number 0 painted on the side of its head. From what he could see, it had 6 massive red glowing eyes. Aside from that, he couldn't see anything else. There was a part of him that said, try and take it down, but the rational, reasonable side to him said, fuck that, that is not worth the effort. He was inclined to agree with the rational side. And so, he booked it, running as far away from it as he could. He already had an injured shoulder to deal with. He was not going to deal with trying to fight that, even if it was possible, which it most certainly wasn't. As Bakugo ran, he dove into another alleyway opposite the one that led to the robot and ran down it, passing by another 3-pointer. He went to destroy it with an explosion, only to see a cleaver carved down the middle of the machine with a screeching, irritating shrill. Bakugo didn't cover his ears, though. He had been used to those kinds of noises because of his quirk. Moments later, a girl with purple hair leapt over the machine before, and he couldn't believe he was seeing this. In midair, she stabbed both halves of the machine that she had already cut in half, and seemingly without breaking a sweat tossed them into another 3-pointer which was promptly destroyed after the fact. All the while, the teen landed gracefully and with a smirk on her face. She exhaled, looking over at Bakugo before huffing, "You're the guy from the bus, yeah?" the teen asked as Bakugo blinked, looking at the girl over to 2 destroyed robots, then back to the girl. "Yeah, question, what's your quirk?" Bakugo asked as the teen raised an eyebrow. "Not even gonna ask a girl their name? Damn." The purplet mumbled before she cracked her neck from side to side. "Earphone jacks, why? How the hell are you so strong then?" Bakugo nearly shouted as the purplet stifled a laugh. Bakugo was getting irritated, just like how he used to be whenever someone flippantly answered him. Sharply inhaling, the blonde calmed himself as the girl sighed. "That's 'cause of a technique I know. Boosts the body's physical abilities. If we both make it into the UA, I can teach you if you want?" the purplet said before placing the 2 arm-length cleavers on her back, holstering them on the leather straps that had been stitched into her jacket. Bakugo frowned, scanning the immediate area as the sound of a building collapsing off to his far right rang throughout the mock city. There were no more robots in the immediate area that weren't all deactivated or butchered by some sort of power or another. Some of the robots were still steaming from being short-circuited by something. If he had to guess, it was some sort of electricity quirk. Yeah, sure, is the exam almost over or? It's all over. This is the end of the exam. Everyone, please exit calmly and quietly. Return to the bus you were on when you got here. If you need medical attention, the medical staff at UA will come to see you now. And with that announcement, the exam ended. The purplet snickered to herself before turning her back on Bakugo and beginning to walk away. "Come on, we gotta go. We can talk more on the bus if you want?" Begrudgingly, Bakugo grumbled and followed after the girl. However, he couldn't help but notice that she walked with an air of confidence. Her hands were inside her pockets, and her head was held up high. Even though she should be tired, she didn't look to be, and if she wasn't showing it. It was admirable in a way. Even he was tired, and he didn't get tired all too often. The exam had beaten him over with a stick. If this was what hero work was going to be like, then he was going to need to train even harder. He needed to increase his stamina, somehow. Perhaps that technique has something to do with how she isn't tired. Katsuki mused, scratching his chin in thought. He could feel a few hairs starting to form. He grimaced, "Really? Of all times now I have to start growing facial hair? Heh, whatever. I'll get rid of it when I get home." And thus, that was how his day ended. The bus ride back to the main center wasn't eventful. While he did talk to the girl he met, her name was Jairu Kyoka, as she had informed her, it wasn't about anything important. The only thing they talked about was their performance during the physical exam. When they got off the bus, they went their separate ways. Katsuki, in the back of his mind, really wanted to meet her again someday. If not for the fact that they would be in the same school, but for the fact that she held good company. When Izuku stepped out of the portal, instead of finding himself in an office like he had been expecting, instead, he found himself at a bar. A dusty, dingy, derelict bar. Well, derelict wasn't the right word for it, but it was dusty. The bar hadn't been cleaned in what looked like days. Even at a surface level, he could see dust piling up on tables, and unwashed glasses decorating the counter behind the bar. Although he did have to give the Mistman credit where credit was due, if he was running this place by himself, it looked a hell of a lot better than what he had originally assumed a bar to look like. There were no split drink stains and no fragments of broken glass anywhere. To that end, the bar looked cleaner than what he had imagined a single-owned and operated bar to be. My apologies for the slight mess. I have been in a rush today, so I have had no time to do a proper wipe-down of the place, Hero Cannibal-san, the Mistman said, stepping beside Izuku as the teen nodded. As soon as the man was done speaking, he couldn't help but notice a man side-glaring at him at the bar table. He was a thin man. His red eyes blared through the fingers of a severed hand which rested upon his face. On his shoulders, neck, waist, and upper and lower arms were more sets of hands. There was even a hand on the back of his head. The man was also very pale, though not due to illness, but due to a lack of sunlight. His hair was a light blue, and his slouched position made him appear a little pathetic at first glance. This brat is the famed Hero Cannibal? The man rasped, glaring at Izuku with a level of contempt he had only seen once before in Bakugo, back before he had changed after Izuku's supposed death. This brat's just a poser. Why the hell did you bring him here, Kurojairi? Izuku brought his expression up to a snarl, baring his teeth. In the blink of an eye, one of his bone whips snapped forth, tearing off one of the man's many severed hands, specifically the left one on his neck before he reeled it back in, catching it in his right hand. The man looked startled, recoiling slightly as he felt around his neck. Next time, I'll sever your head from your body. Maybe I'll even carve up your body and make hamburgers out of it. Though I've always preferred raw food to cooked food, Izuku threatened, keeping up the guise of him being human to earn this man's trust. Tossing back the hand to the man, the blue-haired villain put it back in place, all the while he measured a glare toward Izuku. You little brat. Who do you think you are? Some sort of boss? The now apparent manchild raged, slamming his hand atop the bar counter as Izuku frowned. Is this, manchild, really your leader? Izuku asked Kurojairi, the Mistman, who sighed. Before he could speak up, the TV in the back of the bar sprung to life with the words, audio only, on display. He is merely the face of the League of Villains, Hero Cannibal. I am the mastermind behind this little group here. It is a pleasure to make your acquaintance. It isn't every day one gets to speak to someone who has climbed the ranks of the underground, enough so that the commission is willing to give you the threat rank of SS, is it not? The baritone, cool, calm, and collected voice behind the TV spoke as Izuku narrowed his crimson eyes. I see. The leader was not willing to come to see me in person. Perhaps they are sick and injured? If they are a powerful villain, then that makes sense. The other reasonable conclusion to bring is that they are a coward. Either way, it is a relief that the person I am talking to is at least competent. Sensei, do you actually believe this kid? Is he really the Hero Cannibal? This brat? The manchild ranted as the voice, Sensei, chuckled darkly. I am very sure of that fact, Tamura. Besides, why else would he come if he did not wish to keep his anonymity from the public? The voice noted as Izuku bit back the urge to curse. So he had been right, if he hadn't come, then they would have outed his identity. Although, I must ask, why work for McDonald's? If you are as powerful as the media makes you out to be, surely you wouldn't stoop as low as to work for someone else? Yes. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't subject myself to this, Izuku began as he snapped his fingers, shifting his form into Izumi. She placed a hand on her hip, her expression one of annoyance. But because of one of my abilities, that being the shapeshift, I'm taking advantage of it. I live a double life. One is Muzan Kibutsuji, the fast food worker and schoolboy, and the other one is Izumi Sugimoto, the Hero Cannibal. The voice chuckled. And you would so freely give out that information? Izumi frowned, taking her hand off her hip as she sighed. You already know one identity, and I doubt it would be difficult for someone to spot the similarities between myself and my alter ego. Thanks to quirks, anything can be possible. The hero cannibal, whose quirk isn't known, having the ability to shapeshift makes a lot of sense when you realize that my identity has never been uncovered. A reasonable deduction. You're smarter than you look. However, you mentioned that shapeshifting is one of your powers. Please, explain. The voice asked, though it was more of a demand than anything else. Still, though, Izumi remained undeterred from the silent demand. Now, sir. I don't think I should give away all of my secrets. I'm not that easily tricked, Izumi replied as she put her hands behind her back. Now, I would like to know why I have been summoned here. It isn't often that I show myself. Rightfully, I should kill you all for the sake of my anonymity. But, I'll humor you, just this once. So, go ahead, what is it you wish of me? There was a brief moment of silence in the room. In that silence, Tamura began to scratch at his neck. Kurojire's yellow eyes narrowed, and the voice on the TV stayed silent. Almost as if they hadn't expected Izumi to be so direct and honest. Truth be told, Izumi wasn't expecting this meeting. She hadn't been expecting anything like this, and never in her right mind thought that she would meet other villains. Although, she was honest about killing everyone in the room should she dislike the reason why she was summoned here. She didn't know everyone's strength, their quirks, or their overall abilities. But, if they were bold enough to summon her here, and have the gall to threaten her so openly, she ought to not judge them to be weak. Very well, the voice finally spoke up. It is only right to give you that courtesy. I simply wish to speak to you and to extend an olive branch. I have many connections within the criminal underground that spans the globe, the likes of which only some villains would dream to have. You are a competent villain in your own right, one that, as I previously mentioned, managed to climb the ranks to become an SS-level threat in a relatively short amount of time. Even the hero killer Stain is only an S-level threat. You have only been active for 4 years, whilst he has been active for a little over a decade. It also speaks to your level of strength due to your young age. You were soundly defeating heroes who would otherwise be twice your skill level at, if I am to assume correctly, 12 years old. That is beyond impressive. And so, with that in mind, I wish to ask for an alliance. If you require money, I will deliver it to you via a broker. If you require people to turn into demons, I will supply you with such. In return, all I ask is for you to answer the call of duty should I have Kurojire call upon you. However, whether you wish to help or not is entirely up to you. Izumi froze, eyes wide in shock. How did this disembodied voice know? The demon he killed, he understood, they were a demon after all. But this was different. Before he could ask, the voice chuckled. You look shocked. Don't be. I have had a long time to study the past. Demons are not new to me and never have been. I can tell you're one based solely on the fact that you have cat-like eyes, along with the multiple abilities you have displayed, the first of which being those lightning-fast whips of yours and your shape-shifting. 2 abilities that the former king of demons was documented as having. Izumi frowned but showed no signs of anger. His explanation, while aggravating, was sound. It would make sense for the Demon Slayer Corp to have recorded information about not only demons but the king of demons as well. Still, though, that did not mean that Izumi was proud to be ratted out like this. Demons. Tamura muttered, you can turn people into demons? The manchild asked, his scratching intensified. What does that even mean? Izumi scoffed. Nothing you'll ever know, because I don't plan on turning you into one. I don't need another child to look after, the hero cannibal snarked as she looked back at the TV. Very well, after brief consideration, I'll take you up on that offer. Now, may I please depart? I have a daycare to be. My little sister is waiting for me. Very well. Kurojire, open a portal to the alleyway where you found Ms. Hero Cannibal. As the voice gave the command, no later did the portal appear before Izumi. Without so much as a thank you, Izumi exited the bar, the portal closing behind her as she cursed under her breath. She had been completely outplayed, and even if she did try and maneuver her way around the words of the disembodied voice, a part of her believed that it would have been of no use. Either way, she was already pinned down under the threat of her identity being revealed, and that was something she just couldn't allow. On top of that, the voice knew she had been a demon. And now, not only did they have 2 things on her, but she had stupidly confirmed both. Then again, even if she had denied either accusation, she was sure the voice would have called her out on her bullshit. The voice seemed to be rather intelligent both in how they carried themselves and also how they spoke. There was no pulling the wool over their eyes, even with the use of Silver Tongue. Silver Tongue didn't work over radio waves, meaning that while she could have convinced Kurojire and Tamura, she couldn't have convinced the voice. And because of that, her ploy wouldn't have worked. And that was what annoyed her most of all. The voice seemed to have planned the interaction. Almost as if she had been stalked. And if that was the case, the man or woman behind the voice was no joke. Izumi's blood boiled. How could she have allowed herself to be played like that? Sighing, Izumi calmed down and reverted into Izuku/Muzan. He was running late, and Eri was probably getting worried. When he picked her up, he was going to need to do some shopping. Eri was a human, not a demon, and therefore she needed to eat human food. As of right now, Izuku had no plans for turning Eri into a demon. The change would mentally scar her more than she already was, and warp her mentality irreversibly. Izuku knew she had been abused by how she acted. She was very skittish around other people and never wanted to leave his side. Even when Izuku went to drop Eri off at the daycare while he went to school and afterwards, did his shift at McDonald's. He had to bribe her by making her something she wanted to eat for dinner, of which she chose pork stir-fry, as Ochako had made it for her when she was staying in her custody after she had been taken away from Bakugo during Ito's rampage and death. When Izuku found out who caused harm to the little girl, they would not live to see another day. Izuku sighed. He needed to calm down. Besides, the last thing he wanted to be was angry and frustrated in front of Eri. If he was, then she would be scared, and that was the last thing that Izuku wanted Eri to be. Anger scared most little children, but for Eri, it was doubly so. It must have had something to do with her abuser, and the last thing he wanted was to remind Eri of her abuser. And so, after he calmed himself, Izuku turned on his heel and walked out of the alleyway, beginning his short walk to the daycare. A fist clashed against a wooden desk, with splintering as golden yellow eyes glared at the floor with intense fury. How could this have happened? MCPD, one of the police forces that he had bought out, had been completely eviscerated. There were reportedly no survivors, and everyone in the building had been torn apart and picked clean. According to the news, it was as if a tornado of violence and depravity had torn through the building, leaving nothing but semi-rotting corpses and piles of bones. The idea of someone eating another person made Kaichisaki's stomach churn. It was the height of uncleanliness. So many germs, so many diseases, and so much disgusting blood covering every inch of the building. It made him shudder in disgust. But, beyond that, it threw yet another wrench in his plans. It was clear that whoever had taken Eri was more than just some random intervening nobody. In fact, this kind of behavior reeked of the hero cannibal. The only issue was that it wasn't their MO, meaning that it was most likely a copycat. So his fear of that possibility was unwarranted. Currently, he had gathered all of the 8 bullets into his office to conduct a meeting about what to do going forward. Speaking of his office, it was a rather large room, that much was expected. It had a desk and chair, which was where he sat. The desk was neat and tidy, with stacks of papers off to the right, with a feather pen to the left. There was a basket labeled "Reports," which was also full. As for the room itself, 2 double doors were acting as the entrance. Both doors were made out of dark oak and had golden door handles. The 2 doors were omnidirectional, meaning they would swing open and slam closed, as well as do the reverse. There were also several paintings decorating the walls, most of which being of birds in trees and of flowers, all of them having been painted by Chronostasis. The office was full at the moment, as it would be for this occasion. Every member of the 8 bullets was scattered about the room. Some were sitting on wooden chairs, others were standing with their arms behind their backs, and those that weren't doing either of those were leaning against the walls. "This is quite vexing," one of the 8 bullets, Hekijitingai muttered, his left hand stroking underneath his brown plague doctor mask. The man wore a black yukata, with a pair of wooden geta on his feet. It was a rather traditional outfit, one that the blonde-haired man had preferred over modern outfits. "What do you suppose we do, Oyabun?" Overhaul frowned, eyes closed as he thought about recent events. 2 weeks ago, Eri was in his clutches. Everything was running smoothly, and the quirk erasing drug was close to perfection. All he would need is a few more months until it was complete. But then, the little brat escaped, and it got worse when the boogeyman, aka All for One, possibly had her in his clutches. Again, it was only a chance for this to be the case. He had been hoping that to be true, but on the off chance that it wasn't, he would have to make do with the blood he had. Granted, that blood was quite a lot, around several gallons, but he would have to find some way to replicate it without Eri as time went on. However, that was if she was with All for One. If she wasn't, then he was going to do everything in his power to get her back. For the time being, he needed to lay and wait to see if any of his workers had found her, and wait until they reported back to him. At the moment, Kai began, overlooking his 8 bullets with narrowed and patient eyes. We wait until we hear from those who we still have scattered about the major cities. If, in a week, we hear nothing back from them, we will expand our search. I don't like all of this waiting around and doing nothing, Oyabun. It's making me anxious, a large man with long, flowing red hair spoke up, his arms crossing over his chest. His mask was ripped at the neck, covering his entire face. It had a metal jaw that hinged like a real mouth, something that annoyed Kai, but he let it slide because otherwise, he would never hear the end of it, while the rest of the mask was a suffocating black. It had white mesh eye holes with yellow plating around them, making the mask look more intimidating. The rest of his outfit consisted of a ripped white t-shirt, and a pair of dark pants with a light blue tunic hanging down just below his ankles, all held together by 2 dark brown belts. It was completed by a pair of black military boots with soles meant for climbing mountains. Around his arms were metal braces that acted as extremely large brass knuckles. I am very aware of that, Rappa, Kai rumbled as the man huffed. Then why don't we start breaking faces? It can't be that hard, yeah? Rappa started, craning his neck to the side. The runt can't have gone that far, right? Rappa stated. Before Kai could interject, the man continued. Don't get me wrong, even I want nothing to do with All for One. But, all of this caution is being used on the chance that we're dealing with All for One. For all we know, some runt with a shape-shifting quirk is playing hero, and if that's the case, they have to still be in Muzutafu, which was where Eri was last seen, yeah? Rappa pointed out, as Kai reclined in his chair, fingers steepled as the Yakuza boss lowered his head with a demeaning glare. Yes. She was, and need I remind you it was those who I put you in charge of that lost her. You of all people have no place to speak, Rappa, Kai spat as Rappa seemingly narrowed his eyes under his mask if the scrunching of the fabric was anything to indicate. Yeah, I know that. That's why I'm being pushy. I want to rewrite my wrongs, Rappa grumbled. I already slashed my stomach for the failure, and I didn't die. That means I get to make up for it, as you said I would. Rappa's voice gained a dangerous edge as he took a step forward, his hulking form towering over Kai. Which is exactly why it pisses me off that we're sitting here and doing jack shit. Rappa, Chronostasis growled. Know your place. You dare speak to Overhaul like that? Says his boyfriend, Rappa spat back, making Chronostasis flinch. Shut your mouth, does it look like I'm talking to you? I'm talking to the Oyabun, not you. As the words left his mouth, Rappa turned his attention back to Kai, who was practically seething in his chair. Sit around and wait, you say, and look at what that's accomplished? A fat lot of nothing. If this was All for One, do you really think that he wouldn't have come out of hiding yet? Are we all forgetting what the brat's quirk is? Oh yeah, it's rewind. If the rumors of his extensive injuries brought to him at the hands of All Might are true, do you really think he wouldn't capitalize on his new prize? He would have flattened us after getting his body back to a better condition than what it supposedly is in, yeah? The more Rappa spoke, the more he leaned into Kai's face, and the more Kai's glare became dangerous, and his face contorted into a furious sneer underneath his mask. So, tell me, Oyabun, what do you think would have happened if this really was All for One we were dealing with? Rappa, you are treading on dangerous territory. If you value your life, you'll shut up. If you don't, then you'll overhaul me and never put me back together, yeah? Rappa interrupted Kai, the edge in his voice increased as Rappa reclined back to his full height. Okay then. Well, let me remind you what happened the last time you tried that. Last I checked, the only reason you beat me was cause your stupid fuck buddy slowed me down. I was beating your ass the last time we fought. There was a dreadful tension building up in the air as the two stared each other down. Kai was reminded of that horrible fight by the intense glare that Rappa was no doubt sending his way underneath that mask. He could still feel the phantom pains of broken bones and torn ligaments. Rappa was definitely a terrifying individual, but with his quirk, with Overhaul, even he would bow to him. I believe that is enough, Rappa, Hikiji spoke up, catching the man's attention. Leave Oyabun alone, the force field user continued as a thin yellow wall appeared between Rappa and Kai. Back away, Rappa. Know your place. Rappa huffed, turning his back on Overhaul before storming out of the office. When he left, Hikiji sighed, deactivating the force field before he looked back at Kai and spoke. Although, I'll give the brute credit where credit is due. He does bring up a good point. All for One would have already made his move by now. That safely erases him from the picture. If that is the case, then we will take further action. But until I get definitive proof, then I want to tread carefully. The last thing I want to do is expose an opening for All for One or any of his lackeys to abuse, Kai replied as Hikiji nodded, humming before he bowed. Then that is all for me, Hikiji stated as Kai overlooked the rest of the 8 bullets. Is there anything else anyone wants to say? Kai asked, earning a bout of silence with some minor fidgeting from a few of the others. Kai nodded, standing up with narrowed eyes. Then this is what we will do. 1 week. That is all I will wait for. Until I gain some notable information from one of the scouts, then. Before Kai could finish, someone barged into the office, panting and out of breath. It was one of the scouts. They were a middle-aged man wearing a full white face mask, along with a black muscle shirt and black jeans. They were fairly unremarkable as appearances go, but they were important to the Yakuza nevertheless. Excuse you. Why are you interrupting this meeting? This better be important, Kai growled as the scout cleared his throat, looking up at Kai with a confident gaze. Many apologies, Oyabun. But this is important. Really, important, the man paused, regaining his breath as he stood up straight, posture reflecting someone who had completed a very important task and was filled with confidence, so much so it masked the apparent tiredness lurking within their eyes. We found her. We found Eri. I would have tried to take her, but she was with the shapeshifter who appears to be some random kid, and was talking to several other adults, all of whom were convinced that Eri was his. Kai's eyes widened. Now that was some good news. Beyond that, actually. That was excellent news. Eri was found, and not only was she found, but they also found the person who had taken her. Granted, it wasn't like that did anything for them because they could change their shape at will, but at the very least it confirmed that the chances of All for One being behind this whole thing were slimmer. However, there was one small detail that irked him more than anything, and that was that this whole time they were being duped by some child. Some teenage brat who dared to steal away Eri from them? This whole time, his men and his police were being slaughtered and ravaged by some kid? How in the bloody hell was that even possible? The Shai Hisaikai was one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the whole of Japan, and some brat was running circles around them with his secret weapon. When he got his hands on that brat, he was going to teach him a lesson. One that he would never soon forget. But, until then, he had to worry about where Eri was being kept. Where was she? Where was she hiding? Kai demanded, a hint of urgency in his voice as the scout straightened himself out more, putting his hands at his sides as he continued. According to the other scouts I was with, she frequents Takomata Daycare, which is located in Muzudafu City, a few blocks away from Muzudafu Private Middle School, and sandwiched between 2 12-story tall housing apartments. She goes there daily from the hours of 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. and gets picked up by the shapeshifter always at 6 p.m., the scout explained as Kai raised an eyebrow. Now this was interesting if not a little infuriating. This scout had so much information, and not only that but pinpoint and detailed information. It begged the question of why he had, most likely, been withholding it. Perhaps he had a reason. Most of the scouts did, and while he was a little worked up from his confrontation with Rappa, he could still think rationally. You seem to have a lot of information on this place. I assume you were making sure to confirm this information before giving it to me? Kai questioned as the scout nodded. We were making sure that it wasn't a coincidence and also making sure that he wasn't switching up places every day, so we waited a few days to get this information to you, mostly to confirm that we had everything right, the scout replied as Kai chewed the inside of his cheek. Thank you, Chronostasis spoke up, making Kai glance in his direction. Now, please leave. The same goes for the rest of you, this meeting is dismissed. Overhaul has a lot on his mind, and the last thing he needs is a distraction, the white-haired man stated. Kai was going to object, but everyone else had already begun to leave. When they did, and when the door closed, Kai turned to Chronostasis with a frown underneath the black mesh mask he was wearing. Why did you do that, Chrono? I was fine, Kai said as Chronostasis took off his mask and removed his hood. His expression glowed with, "Are you serious?" written all over his face. It was the same look that he would give Kai when he snapped at someone for no justifiable reason, and it made Kai sigh. Alright, so maybe I wasn't. But you didn't have to call off the meeting. You were seconds away from killing someone. I could see it in your eyes. Rappa provoked you and it took everything for you to not make him a splatter on the wall, Chrono stated, arms crossed across his chest as his frown deepened. Firstly, you need to attend anger management again for the 3rd time this week, and secondly, you need to get some more sleep. You're running off of what? 2, maybe 3 hours of sleep? Chrono, Enough, Kai, Hari interrupted, sighing as he pinched the bridge of his nose. Look, I'm the brains behind the operation, you manage the finances and make sure everyone is listening to orders. So, allow me to do my job and look out for you. Both as your business partner and, more importantly, as someone who cares about you. Kai, for his part, relented. For as much as he wanted to disagree with Hari, the man was right. He had felt that he was getting more than a little aggravated, and with his mission being upended because of a loose window pane and Eri's surprising upper body strength, seriously, he kept her malnourished for a reason. How the hell did she have enough strength to climb out of a window? The girl was far away from the main base in Esuha and in the hands of some brat. That brat is going to pay for what he's doing. Kai snarled, clenching his hand into a fist. Hari placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded silently. Kai meant that. The brat was going to pay for so much as laying his dirty, bacteria-covered hands on Eri. He was going to make sure that boy paid for not only crossing him but crossing the Yakuza. Once Eri was back in his hands, he would hunt down that boy till he either killed himself or Kai killed him. That was more than adequate for the stress that brat put on Kai, for the damage done to his operation. He was going to get Eri back, even if it was the last thing he did. Eri, dinner's ready. Izuku called out as he finished putting the small pile of mashed potatoes on Eri's plate. Originally, Izuku had planned on making rice with Eri's chopped up steak, peas, and carrots, but Eri had insisted on having potatoes. He didn't know why Eri had, but Izuku chalked it up to the fact that she wanted to have potatoes. Besides, she had had rice for the whole week, and she had been a good girl, so giving her something she wanted wasn't too big of a deal. That, and it wasn't as if potatoes were bad for her. They were high in both potassium and vitamin C, which was something that Eri was lacking. The poor girl was lacking in a lot of vitamins. Not only that, but she was malnourished to the point where when Izuku first found her, she had mostly skin and bones. According to Ochako, for the few days that she had Eri in her care, Eri was against eating too much, and that made sense. Her little stomach probably couldn't have handled it. Especially how little she had been eating already if she had been being fed at all. Now, though? Now, Eri had more skin on her bones. She was still thin, but she wasn't sickly thin. When she was first dropped off at the daycare looking like skin and bones, the worker there asked why she had been. Izuku had explained that she was a homeless kid that he had taken home to care for, which got the daycare worker off of his back. Everyone in the community was invested in her health, and by the community, he meant his demons and the daycare that she was going to. In fact, Izuku had been pretty clueless about what to feed Eri for a little bit. The daycare attendant had been the one to give him a list of things she should eat to get her back to a proper weight, something that he had thanked her profusely for. Yes, he was a demon. Yes, he ate humans. And yes, he was extremely smart. But that didn't mean he knew everything. Not only that, but he had been so used to eating humans that he had forgotten what proper portion sizes were. With a little help from one of the other parents at the daycare, a woman by the name of Shino Sosaki, who was actually the aunt of one of the kids there, had told him what amount of food would be best for little Eri. And, as it turned out, having her eat in small portions rather than full portions worked better than he had anticipated. Not only that, but the food she was eating was rich with the vitamins she needed. Once he had the chance, he would thank those two profusely for their help. He felt odd for thanking lowly humans, but he had to remember that just because he was a demon, that didn't suddenly make every human inferior. They were important, and he had to remember that. His mother didn't raise a prejudiced child, and she would have taken great offense to his slip-ups in worldview. Turning around, Izuku was about to call Eri's name out again, only to find her sitting at the coffee table. She had already pulled out her pillow to kneel on and she already had her fork in her hand. She was wearing a cute pink shirt with a rainbow plastered across the front, as well as a pair of knee-length blue and red shorts. Eri had selected that outfit of herself, and she quite liked it. Much like Natsumi, Eri didn't much care for girly things. She wasn't a big fan of overly girly stuff. If only she had the same energetic outlook that Natsumi had, he would have been able to call her Natsumi's long-lost sister. Beyond that, Izuku had been getting Eri used to sitting traditionally around a table, as it was proper and respectful. Chairs were convenient, but they were for relaxing and watching the television, not eating a proper meal. That, and unless it was at a school, most people didn't sit on benches or chairs to eat, and he didn't want Eri to get used to that. Bringing Eri her food, Izuku placed it in front of the girl, before going back into the kitchen. Prior to picking up Eri and going shopping for human food, He had followed up on a few of his leads on a couple of degenerate heroes who were extorting money from orphanages and threatening the local families of a neighborhood to pay for their protection. Needless to say, the two tag-team heroes Watchhog, whose quirk was a hedgehog mutant quirk that gave him super speed, and Dr. Mecha, whose quirk was transforming parts of their bodies into weapons and shields, were packed up rather quickly. He had also brought a few black trash bags to carry their chopped-up remains in, which he was keeping in his freezer. Opening the freezer, Izuku opened up the bag labeled Dr. Mecha and pulled out a rather sizable portion of the man's thigh. It was big, it was filling, and more importantly, it would curb his hunger. He had to keep track of that while Eri was living with him. The last thing he wanted to was go feral again and lose someone he cared about. Upon retying up the bag and closing the freezer, Izuku walked back into the living room with the leg in hand and sat across the table from Eri, taking a bite out of the leg as Eri looked on with a raised eyebrow. She had cleaned the plate of the potatoes, and had already picked away at the peas and carrots. The girl ate fast, which was good, but the way she was eyeing his food had him a little worried. "Eri, is there something wrong?" Izuku asked, blood staining his teeth as the little girl shook her head from whatever trance she had been in. Mr. Izuku, why do you eat raw things?" Eri asked, her question innocent in nature as Izuku frowned. "Well, Eri, as you know I am a demon, and demons can't stomach cooked and/or human food. So we resort to eating other people. I specifically target bad people. Evil, nasty, rotten people. At least, when I can help it," Izuku said, his stomach churning at the thought of his mother's destroyed and torn apart body. "Demons eat bad people?" Eri asked, her voice containing a small tinge of hope. Izuku caught onto it immediately and raised a finger to correct her. "I said I eat bad people. I also try to enforce this onto the other demons I create, but it doesn't work most of the time. Their hunger can get the better of them. Frankly, for them, all I care about is them getting stronger. So long as they aren't eating children or actively hunting innocent people, I don't care how they get their food," Izuku corrected as Eri looked down at her food, then stabbed one of the steak bits on her plate, popped it into her mouth, before swallowing. Izuku noticed that the grip on her fork had tightened, and he couldn't tell if Eri was angry or if she was getting upset. Eri was a quiet child, and never really spoke out much unless she was terrified of something. She only talked when spoken to, and so it was hard to tell what she was thinking most of the time. He was about to ask why she was seemingly aggravated before Eri spoke up. "Can you eat the bad man?" Izuku nearly choked on air as he coughed, having to cover his hand so he didn't get blood all over Eri's food, which would have probably happened otherwise. It had come completely out of left field, so much so that it shocked Izuku. Once his little coughing fit was done, he grunted, looking back at Eri. "I'm sorry, can I do what?" Izuku asked as Eri shrunk in on herself, looking away with a tinge of fear in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that." No, stop," Izuku interrupted, putting down the piece of meat he was eating, placing his hands on his knees as he had one of his whips gently force Eri to look at him. This specific whip had no sharp edge, as he had created it to be that way he didn't turn the risk of cutting her. "Now hold on there just a minute, Eri. I want you to repeat to me what you just said." "That I'm sorry?" Eri asked, her voice timid as Izuku sighed. "No, Eri. I mean what you said before that," Izuku corrected as Eri sheepishly glanced at the ground. "See, can you eat the bad man?" Eri asked, her voice still timid, as Izuku frowned. The bad man. Who was the bad man? Whoever it was clearly linked to whatever trauma she had been dealing with. There were no ifs as to when he would make sure this person suffered, due to the fact that it was definitely the case that it was this bad man's fault that Eri had suffered. There was just one problem with her request. "I would, had I an idea of who and where this bad man is," Izuku replied as Eri, still tense, nodded. I know. I don't know where the bad man is." "Sorry," Eri muttered as Izuku reached out and ruffled Eri's hair. The blue-haired girl shrunk into herself, tears threatening to poke out from her eyes as Izuku retracted his hand before he rose the girl's head to look into his eyes. Grabbing a napkin from his pocket, he dapped at the corners of her eyes and smiled. "Eri, you do not need to cry. You shouldn't feel upset, it's not like you have upset me. You're just a child. I don't expect you to drill everything into your head," Izuku said, drawing back his hand as he stood up, tall and looming but motioning for Eri to stand up as well. "Follow me, Eri. There is something that has been on my mind lately." Without much resistance, Eri followed Izuku into the kitchen. When he stopped, he motioned for her to stay still. He hadn't said anything to her about what he saw at the daycare, but he couldn't have helped but notice that they had been being watched by a few people who tried and failed to look inconspicuous. As such, he had a feeling that whoever had previously had Eri in their position was more than just your average gang leader. Izuku was more than aware of that he couldn't always be in Eri's immediate proximity to protect her. That was a given due to his double life as both the hero cannibal and ordinary teenager. He had to keep both identities active, and with a small child, it was more than difficult to juggle everything. So, he had to do something. Knowing this, and knowing that they were being watched, Izuku had to come up with a backup plan. He had to make sure Eri was safe. And so, he knew that, eventually, he would have to turn Eri into a demon for her own protection. In order to do that, he would need to be the one to turn her. Or, more specifically, she needed to come into contact with his blood. The only way he would be able to do that is if he injected his blood into her. However, that would require his presence. And because of that aforementioned issue of him not being able to be around Eri 24/7, he had come up with an idea. Opening up a drawer closest to the fridge, he pulled out a little bag. This bag was a bag of epidermic needles. As soon as Eri saw them, she took a step back. Izuku raised an eyebrow. She was scared of needles? That was an issue. Izuku raised a reassuring hand, though that did nothing to ease her. Do not worry, Eri. I am not using them on you. But, I want you to pay close attention. Eri, still scared, relaxed if only slightly as Izuku pulled out one of the needles that he acquired. Now, how did he get the needles? Well, he simply purchased some online. It was strangely scary how readily available medical needles were. These specific needles were both injector and extractor needles, dual use, meaning they could be used twice before the needle head broke. Jabbing himself in the neck with the needle, he drew out a full vial of blood. It was a lot of it, but that was the point. It was more than enough for her to transform into a demon, and a strong one at that. After he drew his blood, he wiped down the needle head and put a cap on it. He walked up to Eri, opened her right hand, and placed the needle filled with his blood in it. Eri looked at the needle, then back at Izuku, back to the needle, then right back to Izuku. What is this? My blood, Izuku replied, a curt smile on his face. Getting down on a knee, he looked Eri dead in her eyes as he wrapped one of his hands around hers, before speaking. I can't be around you 24/7. You know this, and it's why I take you to that daycare. Izuku paused, breathing in sharply before exhaling. I've begun to notice that we are being watched. Most likely by this bad man you mentioned. So, just in case, should you ever find yourself in danger, I want you to inject yourself with that blood. Eri's eyes widened, before looking at the needle. Seeing this, Izuku continued. It will hurt. It will hurt a lot. You will experience excruciating pain. The transformation is a very painful one, so I have been told. That is why it is a last resort. You may go unconscious from the pain, and when you wake up, you will be different. But, you will also be strong. You will be able to defend yourself. And no one, not even that bad man, will ever be able to hurt you again. As Izuku explained, Eri's grip on the needle increased. It was clear she was happy about the development, and whatever fear she had about that particular needle was gone. That was good. But the look of excitement in her eyes was a little unnerving. Eri, becoming a demon will take away your humanity? Izuku said as Eri looked up at him. What does that mean? Eri asked as Izuku inhaled sharply, looking away. He didn't want to confront this, but it was better if he did. It was better if she knew before anything horrible could happen. Softly exhaling, he looked back at Eri and let go of her hand, before placing both of his hands on her shoulders. You have friends, yes? Human friends? At the daycare? Izuku asked as Eri fidgeted, nodding. Iizumi-kun. He's a little mean, but he's also really nice, Eri replied as Izuku raised an eyebrow. Another Izumi, huh? It was most likely a family name, but still, it was a little funny. He was getting distracted. He needed to get back on track. I see. Well, as a demon, you will have an unstoppable urge to kill and eat him. To kill and eat any human you come across. I can handle that pressure because I am as old as I am. But for someone like you? A child? The change will do irreversible damage. To put it simply, you'll look like Eri, sound like Eri, and act like Eri, but you won't be Eri. You'll be a monster. That's why it's a last resort. Something to do when there is nothing that can be done, and when I can't be there to help you. Eri nodded slowly. Izuku hoped she understood what he was saying because otherwise, things could get a little complicated. He didn't want Eri to lose her chance at a normal childhood. He wanted Eri to experience life to its fullest. Something he could never do. But if it came down to it, if something happened that made it unavoidable, then it would have to be done. And on that day, should it ever come, he hoped that those who caused Eri's transformation into a demon knew exactly what kind of pain they would be unleashing onto the world. Letting go of her shoulders, Izuku stood up and walked out of the kitchen. Come now, let's finish dinner and then I'll put something on the TV. What would you like to watch today? As Izuku's question was spoken, Eri perked up with a smile, sliding the covered needle into her shorts pocket and running after Izuku. Oh! I want to watch on Ponman. Izuku couldn't help but snicker at her joy. He was going to protect that smile of hers. No matter what, for as long as he could, Eri's smile would live rent-free in his heart. He was going to make sure that smile was preserved for as long as it could be. Izuku would never let any harm come to Eri. Once he found out more about the bad man, he was going to make him pay for so much as even laying a finger on Eri. He would take great pleasure in skinning the man from head to toe and making him watch as he and his demons ate him alive. Yes, that is more than adequate punishment for scum such as he. This bad man will pay for his crimes against Eri. He will never soon forget the pain and trauma that he has put upon such a pure vessel of joy. He will pay. I don't get it, why does everyone I corner just want to run away? It's so rude. Natsumi taunted, stalking toward a beaten and battered thug. Blood pooled from their shoddy ski mask, which covered their whole face except for their eyes, nose and mouth. It was kind of counterintuitive to do that, the eye holes, anyway, namely because of the fact it would no doubt get him identified quicker than not having his eyes exposed, considering that was what police and the like used to track criminals faster, minus DNA testing. The least the dumbass could have done was wear sunglasses. Honestly, Natsumi knew that thugs were dumb, but not this dumb. There was a hole atop the ski mask, and there was an obvious reason as to why, what with the man's hair being made entirely of snakes, all of which were dark green, with red piercing eyes. They were nervous and afraid, their hissing reverberating through the building that they were in. Speaking of the building they were in, it was a simple gas station just a few blocks away from a local library. The gas station was your standard Shell Gas Company-owned station. The inside was just as what was to be expected, a Slurpee machine off to the right, a plexiglass slider door freezer, a few shelves with on-the-road snacks, and a bunch of fridges to keep soft drinks and the like in. Natsumi had originally been here to see if she couldn't win at one of those keychain gotcha things at the back corner of the store, seeing as she had some extra money she had stolen from her last kill. Of course, that had been ruined because of this thug, and seeing as they were a crook, well, that meant they were free rein. When the guy first walked in, he threatened the nice lady at the counter with a gun. Just a regular, standard, run-of-the-mill M1911. There were no attachments, not even a specialized grip, or an extended magazine, it was just a regular, plain old gun. The thug was probably using it because they lacked a flashy quirk or something of the sort. Boring. But just the right kind of boring to mean that no one would care if they were killed. Stay back from me, you creepy bitch. The robber threatened as the store clerk from behind the counter recoiled from the loud voice. Natsumi, for her part, just tilted her head in a childlike fashion, one that would spark the idea of curiosity. And it would have worked, had it not been for the creepy smile that had been drawn across her face. What? You think I'm creepy? Ah, that's just mean. Natsumi said, holding back a giggle. Oh, but you know what's even meaner? Robbing a store at gunpoint. The white-haired, rainbow-eyed demon chirped, bringing her left arm up and over her head. As she did, there was a gleam in her right eye, and her creepy smile dropped into an emotionless frown as she spoke. For that, you must die. Blood demon art. Transmogrification, Jormungandr. With a simple utterance of those words, Natsumi's left arm began to transform, white scales growing out of her ashen-pale skin as her left hand split apart and reformed into the mouth of a snake. The skin on the back of her hand began to balloon, swell, and contort as scales began to appear. Two black, soulless eyes appeared out of the sides of the newly formed snakehead, as it hissed. Coming out of the back of the snake were large rocky spikes, about 6 inches in height with cracks in the rocks, and they also seemed kind of wet. Poison dripped from the tips of the large dagger-sized fangs, its forked tongue sticking out and flickering in the air. The snake grew larger than the upper half of Natsumi's body, which should have made her fall over. But, much to the surprise of the thug and the store clerk, no such thing happened. Natsumi simply stood still, a smile on her face as her rainbow eyes glistened with hate. You like snakes, right? Natsumi asked, her voice dripping with anger as the veins in her right arm and forehead became more pronounced. Truthfully, she was angry. She had been having such a great day. Earlier she had killed a few drug addicts, which had made her kind of jittery. Apparently, blood with remnants of drugs like heroin made demons a little twitchy but otherwise left no bad side effects. Anywho said homeless people were asleep when she killed them, so at the very least, they didn't feel any pain. She knew that Midori wouldn't be too fond of her doing that, but then again, he did say that he didn't care how they got stronger, or who they ate so long as they weren't children and that everyone was free reign. She had killed at least 5 homeless dudes in a row before she was narrowly caught by some newbie hero fresh out of hero school. Luckily for that plucky new hero, she was full and wasn't really hungry at the time. Plus, the hero was a newbie, and also probably just graduated, so she wasn't going to ruin his shiny new career. Oh, and Midori was right, humans did taste like whatever her brain wanted them to taste like. For example, the last guy she ate tasted like cotton candy. But now, she had no reason to be thinking of stuff like that. No, she was busy with this douchebag, and all of the problems he had been causing. The robber aimed his pathetic little gun at Natsumi and began firing. The bullets only dented her skin, rather than actually piercing her body. They fell to the floor with not so much as a clang to the ground. It was really pathetic, and it further terrified the robber, who dropped the gun, and began scuttling away, before bumping into one of the shelves behind him. Oh, how Natsumi loved to see punks like them squirm. After all, it was a thug like this one right here that had killed her. And she had vowed to kill any petty thug who would dare hurt someone. She wasn't going to let these worthless scumbags do any more harm than they were already doing. Oh? Did you just try to kill me? Natsumi asked, venom dripping from her new snake arm's mouth. The veins on her forehead began to pulse like a beating heart, and her smile had now turned into a full-on sneer, fangs baring and all. I mean, that wouldn't have worked anyway, but, come on, I'm only 13 you know. Killing a child is like, what, the biggest offense known to mankind, yeah? Fuck you. The robber spat as Natsumi grimaced. Ew, and you're a kitty diddler, gross. What? No, Natsumi giggled as the snake arm recoiled, opening its massive maw as the robber's skin drained of all color. A small little puddle began to form around his legs as Natsumi grinned ear to ear. Its hiss dwarfed the hissing sound of the snakes atop the robber's head, all of whom had shrunk into a defensive stance, not that it was going to matter anyway. Oh well, I don't really care. I've already snacked on 40 or so criminals like you for the last week or so, and Hosu's looking pretty clean because of it, yeah. One more can't possibly hurt, right? As those words left Natsumi's mouth, the robber didn't have a chance to scream before the snake arm lunged forward and clamped its jaws around the man, swallowing him whole before spitting up the bones, all in a matter of seconds. The snow-white-haired demon's arm transformed back to normal as she covered her mouth to suppress a burp. Her mother didn't raise a messy eater, so it paid to have such a dynamic blood demon art. Of course, that was just one of her many abilities, and it only really worked on defenseless crooks. Jormungandr was weak, all things considered, and could be dispatched easily, so only used it on weak crooks like that one. Looking over her shoulder, the cash register lady was hugging herself, shaking in fear as Natsumi frowned. What to do about her? Hey, lady. How old are you? Natsumi asked as the cash register jolted, squeaking like a terrified little mouse. She had orange hair, big, round, blue eyes and tears staining her cheeks. 16. The lady cried as Natsumi sighed. Well then, you're lucky. My lord says I can't kill kids so you'll just have to keep your mouth shut, MK? Or else I'll stalk ya and steal your money. Natsumi said, putting both of her hands behind her back. With the half-assed threat out of the way, Natsumi left the gas station, content in what she had done. A few people were nervously staring at the building, some even were reaching for their phones, as if to call someone, a hero perhaps. Natsumi didn't care, she simply kept walking, minding her own business. Hosu's law enforcement was stingy and only replied to calls if the situation was dire. The reason was because of the oversaturation of heroes in the city. Compared to Muzutafu, which was a much smaller city, only requiring 60 or so police officers to maintain with the help of heroes, Hosu's force was 300 men and women strong, but compared to the nearly over 10,000 heroes that flooded the streets at every hour of the day, yeah, one could understand why the cops barely did their job. If the cops were so useless, then why did the city have them around? Honestly, Natsumi didn't know, and she didn't care. She was more focused on making Midori happy and getting herself nice and strong so she didn't have to worry about being considered weak. Though, the more she thought about it, the more she reasoned that being considered weak wasn't particularly something she needed to worry about. And so, Natsumi aimlessly walked, keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity. She wasn't particularly hungry, but then again, what kind of demon would she be if she wasn't always looking out for something to eat? As she walked, she thought about her other demon comrades. Last she had checked, Ochako was somewhere in Tokyo attacking criminal organizations. Her quirk had been something called gravity, and she also apparently had access to another ability. Not only did she have her quirk, but she had a separate blood demon art. Natsumi wanted to complain, but Uraraka-san had said that it wasn't all that useful, all things considered, and a lot more sadistic for her tastes. Meaning, she probably wouldn't use it unless she needed to. It was that kind of hesitation that got her in trouble the first time, so perhaps Natsumi would have to remind her of that the next time they talked. Then, there was Tsukachi-san. She was all the way out in Hokkaido. She reasoned that she wanted some time away from the massive sprawling cities, and instead wanted to hunt in the rural areas, killing and eating mutantists and racists, as well as take down any members of the Creature Rejection Clan, or the CRC. Frankly, both were doing more noble things than her. She was just picking off drug addicts, street thugs, and small-time villains. They were looking to hunt down the big guys. It was actually kind of upsetting, but oh well. She wasn't really out to hunt down the big fakes or the most evil of villains. She was out here protecting the common folk from the regular street thugs. You know, provided they didn't see her eat the people she was hunting. Then they'd have to join them. Was it twisted? Perhaps, but she was a demon. Midori said humans were cattle, and while she might have been human once, she wasn't a human anymore. The only humans she could ever grow to care about are her mother and stepfather, and even then she didn't want to scare them by reappearing in their lives. Oh, and Eri too. She couldn't forget about Eri. She was such a cute little bean. Always asking questions and being just the most adorable little kid she had ever met. She wanted to squish the little girl's face and pull at her cheeks just like her mom did to her when Natsumi was a little girl. She was big sis Natsu and Midori was big bro. That was so cute. She didn't know what it was about her and little children, but she always saw them as adorable. Off to her left, she heard a scream, which broke her out of her thoughts. To her left was an alleyway, and in it was a woman and a group of men. They were mugging her, and trying to strip the poor lady. Degenerates. That was the first thing that came to Natsumi's mind. And it made Natsumi smirk. She might have been a little full, but when scumbags were doing scumbag things, it was her duty to make them disappear for good. It was like being a vigilante. Except, you know, eating people. With that in mind, Natsumi stared down the alleyway, as her expression became serious. Welp, duty calls. Eri had to admit, the daycare was kind of boring. There wasn't really much to do aside from play with megablocks and draw. And even then she didn't like doing that. Well, the megablocks thing, anyway. She liked drawing, but only when no one was looking. The other kids at the daycare said that her drawing sucked. Big Bro didn't seem to think so, and his opinion was all that mattered to her. Speaking of him, Big Bro always lets her do other things like watch TV and read books. Or, at least try to read books. She was still learning how to properly read and write. It was embarrassing, but it wasn't like she was given an opportunity to get better at it. The bad man never let her read. She was turning 6 years old in a little bit, and she couldn't properly read. The other kids were going to make fun of her for not being able to. It wasn't her fault that Mama let the bad man take her. It wasn't her fault the bad man liked to cut her up and drain her blood. So why did everyone have to make fun of her? She didn't like those other kids at the daycare. They were mean. Well, then again, she was friends with Izumi-kun. And he was mean. But they were meaner than him. They said rude things about her horn, and how she looked mean and evil. They would always ask why she wore gloves. Eri wouldn't answer. Her curse was no one else's to bear but her own. If they already said that she looked evil because of her horn, what would they say about her curse? They would only hate her more. So she never answered them. The only one who she might tell about her curse would be Izumi-kun. Speaking of Izumi-kun, he was the only person in the daycare she liked. He was the first one to approach her, and the first one to not call her drawings bad. He actually liked them quite a bit. She was glad that Izumi-kun liked them. Because otherwise, she would have probably quit drawing. Currently, Izumi-kun was off in the corner minding his own business, sitting there with a frown on his face as he watched everyone. He always did that. He said that if you looked scary and intimidating that no one would bother you. She liked that idea, but he said that she was too cute to be able to be scary. That made Eri feel a little down in the dumps. When she told Big Bro about it, Big Bro agreed with Izumi-kun. The rest of the day she had decided she wasn't going to talk to Big Bro. Because he wasn't supposed to agree with Izumi-kun. But that was on Tuesday. Today was Friday, so she was all over it now. Izumi-kun saw her, and for a brief second his frown disappeared and was replaced with a neutral expression. Not a smile or a scowl, but just a flat line. It was better than what most people got, so that meant he liked her. He never smiled, namely because he said smiling was for nerds. She didn't think so, and on the odd occasion, Eri would catch him smiling. His smile looked nice. It was less creepy than Natsuenai-chan's smile. Natsuenai-chan's smile was a little creepy. She remembered one time when Natsuenai-chan came over at random and turned her fingers into little hedgehogs with bat wings. They were cute, but also creepy. Eri was getting sidetracked. The point was that Izumi-kun was a meanie. Meanies became bullies and Eri wasn't a fan of bullies. But she believed that Izumi-kun could never be a bully. Izumi-kun might be a meanie, but he wasn't a meanie because he hated people, he was a meanie because that was how he acted. He treated everyone like that. Not just Eri or the odd person. He was a meanie to everyone. Big Bro mentioned just before he dropped her off that those creepy guys were still there, watching the building. She instinctively had her hand in her left shorts pocket. It was in that pocket that the needle was in. Big Bro said to use it if those mean people, the people who worked with the bad man, entered the building. She didn't want to. Big Bro said it was going to hurt. But at the same time, Big Bro said that if she used it, she wouldn't be able to be hurt ever again. Hey! Horn! Izumi-kun's voice called out to her. Eri looked over her shoulder and saw him standing just behind her. He was around her height, with black hair and blue eyes. Like her, he had pale skin, and he was wearing a white and blue striped shirt today. Yesterday he wore a pure white one. He was also wearing pants instead of shorts. Oh, and he was also wearing those cool light-up shoes as well. She liked the light-up shoes because they looked pretty. Hey, Izumi-kun, Eri said, turning to fully face him. He snorted, looking at her hand. What's in your pocket? Oh? It's just in case of, emergency, thing. Like, in case I get hurt badly, I have to take it. Like medicine, you know? Eri replied. She was embarrassed that she couldn't say big words without sounding them out. Another thing that Big Bro blamed on the bad man. She blamed him too. He was the biggest meanie. But he actually hurt her instead of saying mean things. Humph, that's baby stuff, Izumi-kun said, plopping down next to her with his hands planted on the ground and behind his back. If you get hurt you're just supposed to tough it out. Eri frowned. Not a bruise or a cut, Izumi-kun. Something like a broken arm, Eri replied as Izumi-kun hummed. They sat in silence for a little bit, before he scratched the back of his neck. Soru, Izumi-kun muttered. Eri looked at the floor. She noticed that the daycare worker, Todoroki-san, was nervously watching the window. She had white hair with red patches, and she had black eyes. She was wearing a blue shirt and a pair of white jeans. She was nice. She often played games with them. Todoroki-san was never usually this worried. She had been a little nervous with all of the bad guys watching the place lately, but she never actually stared outside the window for longer than a few seconds. And, she had a phone up to her ear. Eri could barely make out what it was she was saying, but if she paid attention it sounded almost like a report. A report to who? Probably a hero or something. Eri did pick up on the use of a different word though. Not hero, but dad. Dad, please, I know you're busy but I need you to come down to the daycare. There are a bunch of thugs standing outside, and I have small children who can get hurt. That, seriously, no, that. Dad. Listen to me, that jerk. Todoroki-san cursed as she began tapping on her phone rapidly, calling another person. Except, it didn't matter that she was calling another hero, because the door was kicked open regardless. Several men with masks on their faces barged into the daycare, masks that Eri recognized. The little girl immediately got a chill up her spine as she cowered. They were here. The bad guys were here. She knew what she needed to do but she didn't know if she had the time. Where is she? Where is that brat? One of the thugs screamed at Todoroki-san. Eri took out the needle from her pocket and pulled the cap off. The thug saw her and made a break for her. He was too slow, as Eri managed to jab the side of her neck with the needle. The needle hurt, but she cared more about not being stuck with the bad man to care about pain. She remembered that Big Bro said to push down on the flat thing on top of the needle to get the blood to move. And so she did just that. She emptied the entire needle filled with Big Bro's blood into her body, and immediately after the fact, her muscles immediately began to seize. The veins just underneath her skin flared like they were on fire, and they bulged, looking like something out of a horror movie. Izumi-kun stepped back, horror in his eyes as Eri bit back a scream. The needle dropped to the floor, and just like Big Bro said would happen, the pain was immense. She felt as if her whole body was on fire. Her body shook with agony, as Big Bro's blood began to change her. She could feel it. She could feel the change. But, before she could actually do anything about it, due to the immense amount of pain that Big Bro had warned her about, she slowly began to lose consciousness. Before her vision and hearing were lost, she heard a bunch of screaming, gunfire, and Izumi-kun calling out for her name before his voice was violently stripped away by the shot of a gun. And just like that, Eri lost consciousness. Kai was ecstatic. Eri had just been returned, and the 8 bullets were celebrating. Everyone except Rappa and Hikiji. They were out doing a mission. That was fine, Kai didn't really care all too much about that. The job was something that needed to be done. A rival gang started popping up on their turf, and they were even selling trigger. He wanted to restart the tests immediately, but when hearing that Eri was in a state of unconsciousness, Kai decided against it. He wanted Eri to be conscious of it this time. He typically used a pain-numbing drug to make sure she felt no pain during the tests, but this time he was going to make sure it hurt. To remind her that she was his and that she could never escape him. Eri had made him very, very angry this time. She had grown too bold. That would have to change. He was going to have to punish her for that. That would be her punishment. And then, perhaps, he would lure this boy who had kidnapped her in the first place to the base and kill him in front of her just to remind her that everyone she ever met was fated to die. No one stole Eri away from Kai Chisaki. No one stole away the secret weapon of the Shai Hasaikai. No one stabbed the Yakuza in the back and ran. Just because Pops might have believed in pacifism, did not mean Kai did. Whatever the case was, Eri was back in her room. One of the scouts that had returned her had said that she had jabbed herself with a sort of red liquid before passing out. She was still alive, though her heart was beating twice as fast. Kai would have to look into that at a later time because right now he was busy celebrating Eri's return. That went by a lot quicker than I had expected, Oyabun. Toya, one of the 8 bullets said, chugging back entire shots worth of vodka. He was a scrawny blonde-haired man, wearing a blue shirt with a black tie, along with a pair of black jeans. Next to him was a man with a white mask over his head, and a pair of eye holes and a mouth hole cut out crudely. This was Soramitsu Tabe. Or, as Toya called him, the human vacuum cleaner. "This is why you're the boss, boss." Soramitsu remarked as Kai couldn't help but smile underneath his black mesh mask. Over the course of the 2 years that he had been running the Shai Hasaikai, he had always wondered if he had been fit for leadership. Now he knew better. Everyone liked him, everyone was loyal to him, and while he still had his doubts from time to time, he knew that everyone relied on him. No matter what he thought of himself, he was the rightful leader of the Shai Hasaikai. When Pops woke up from his coma, when he woke Pops from his coma, the Shai Hasaikai would be the strongest it had ever been. If Pops disowned him after that and forced him to commit seppuku, then he would. His only mission in life was to pay back Pops for letting him live in this world longer than he had originally been supposed to. "Great work, Oyabun," Chronostasis said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Kai couldn't help but place his gloved hand over top Chronos, muttering a "thank you" under his breath. Now Kai could relax, knowing that Eri was back where she belonged. She would never leave this facility ever again. He was going to strap her useless body down to that mattress and prevent her from leaving. He would feed her food, he would change her clothes, and he would attach machines to her body so that she didn't have to leave the room ever. The only time that she would ever leave that godforsaken room was when she would be cut up and made to bleed for the creation of the bullets. Perhaps he was a touch angrier than he usually was. Perhaps he was overreacting. Or, perhaps not. Either way, Eri was never going to leave this building ever again. And then, the lights turned red, the sirens of an attack began to blare, and everyone dropped their drinks. A serious expression took over Kai's face as he let go of Chrono's hand. "What?" Kai muttered. "How? That made no sense, their base was hidden for a reason. No one knew where the Shai Hasaikai was. Not even the pro heroes. So how the hell could there be an attack? Everyone, scatter. We will defend this base till our dying breath. Yes, sir. The 8 bullets replied, exiting the main lounge of the underground facility through the front door. Kai dug for his phone and dialed Hekiji's number. Unfortunately for Kai, the man didn't answer, making the boss of the Shai Hasaikai curse under his breath. Chances were that Hekiji and Rappa were still dealing with that group he had noted about before. What shall we do, sir? Joy Iranaka, or Mimic as he was known, asked. Due to his quirk, mimicry, he was able to jump into small surfaces and become one with them. As such, he usually appeared as a black stitched-up plushie with a white mask and hollow black eyes. He was the director of the Shai Hasaikai, which was 2 rungs under the leader. When neither Kai nor Hari was around, Joy was the one in charge. The tiny little zealot was often erratic due to his fanaticism. When times were rough, he became dead serious. Which was good, because he was one of the 3 backbones of the Shai Hasaikai. We get Aryan pops, and then we leave. If these are the heroes, then we need to make sure we can move to another base without being followed. The 8 bullets will stall the heroes, and we will call them back once we make it safely away from our current location. We will have to destroy the research that we have so the heroes can't trace Eri back to us. Chronostasis, you go get Eri. Mimic, get Pops, and I will handle destroying the evidence. Alright? Yes, sir. Both Chrono and Mimic replied. Mimic walked over to a wall and jumped surfaces, and Chrono left through the front exit, with Kai following close behind. Instead of going straight, Kai went left. That was where the lab was. It would take 10 minutes to cover the distance, even while running. He had to be quick. While all of the hard work would be destroyed, it wasn't like he couldn't just repurchase the equipment from the black market. It wasn't as if it wasn't cheap for him. He just hoped the Chrono would be able to escape the heroes before they reconvened. Hari didn't know what it was he was supposed to have expected upon reaching Eri's room, but it certainly wasn't an unhinged door laying on the ground, with the mutilated bodies of the 2 guards that had been assigned to watch her. Blood decorated the walls, along with scratch marks and spilled out intestines. It was like a monster had run through here. The more he looked at the corpses, the more he began to notice the finer details. The corpses didn't just have deep gashes, almost as if a creature with claws had dug through them, but there were large chunks of flesh and skin bitten out of their body. Faces chewed off and hearts missing. Hari cautiously stepped over to the ruined entrance to Eri's room and saw something that he never wanted to see. Blood stained the room and the walls from top to bottom. It wasn't just the 2 guards who were killed, but more of them, as the bodies in the room, yes, bodies, it wasn't just one, were of multiple guards of varying ranks. Hari was going to be sick. Eri was missing, which meant the monster had taken her, too. God knew what was going to happen to her. But whatever it was, Hari didn't want to be the one to have allowed it to happen. Reaching for his phone, he was seconds away from calling up Kai to let him know what it was he had found, only for a split second to pass, and for his arm up to his elbow to be completely removed. The villain screamed in pain as he held his arm, or at least what remained of it. There had been a gale of wind right in front of him before the attack, but that was it. Blood sprayed everywhere from where the wound had been made, and it caused Hari to fall onto his remaining hand and knees. He could hear something chew away at his limb. The sound of flesh being torn and skin being ripped into was something that he had been accustomed to hearing for obvious reasons, so that was a no-brainer. When he looked over in the direction of where the sound was coming from, he had expected to see a monster. And had that been the case, perhaps he would have died knowing that this attack was the result of the rival gang that they had spotted. But that wasn't the case. His attacker was someone else. His attacker was someone who he had never at all assumed possible of such violence. 2 horns protruded from her head rather than 1. Her hair was the same color as it always was, though it was stained in blood. Her fingers were sharp with claws, and her arms now had red bands that looked like tattoos starting at the wrist and traveling up through her arm. If there were any more of those tattoo-like marks, Hari couldn't see them, as they were hidden by the shirt that she wore. In her right hand was the rest of his arm, and several chunks were missing from it, exposing bone. Eri wiped her face with her left arm, before looking over her shoulder. Hari's eyes widened in both anger and horror at what he saw. The sclera of her eyes were a bright purple, with the iris being a crimson red, and the pupil being a soulless black. They also looked foggy, almost as if she was in a daze of sorts. Her mouth was smeared with blood, and her expression was drawn up in a sneer, the veins in her forehead and neck being more pronounced as if to show that she was furious. A faint growling passed through Hari's ears as he reached for his gun. Upon doing so, Eri threw the arm away as if it were a piece of trash, before lunging toward him. At the same time, Hari had brought out the revolver he kept handy, aimed down the barrel, and fired all 6 bullets at Eri. Whatever she had become, it clearly wasn't human, and if he had to guess, Eri had also been the one to trigger the alarm. If he died now, Kai would be next. Of that he was sure. As with the rest of the 8 bullets. It was his duty as the aide of Kai Chisaki, leader of the Shai Hasaikai, that this rampage of Eri stopped. Countless people would die, of that he was sure. At this point, this was beyond the project. This was beyond petty revenge that Kai probably had planned for Eri out of his spiteful nature. This was about protecting those he held dear. All 6 bullets struck their target true, hitting Eri once in the neck, twice in the chest, and 4 times in the face. Horrifyingly, the bullets didn't so much as even slow her down. If anything, it only made her more angry. Even worse was that Eri had begun to regenerate the wounds. Ripping off his mask and rolling to the right to avoid Eri, Hari bit back a shout of pain as what remained of his arm surged in agony. He would have to ignore it. This was more important. Eri needed to be put down. He just had to find a way to do so before things went from bad to worse. Standing completely still and extending the right bang of his hair, activating his quirk fittingly named chronostasis, and impaling Eri's back with it, Eri flinched and hissed, just like an animal would upon being hurt. His hair could extend up to 10 meters away from him, but it was extremely rough on his scalp. Eri's movements immediately became slower than a snail's, and it would remain that way for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. With the rate that he was bleeding out, he doubted that he could even last more than a few minutes, let alone 10. If he was going to die here, he was going to do it while trying to find a way to kill Eri. To hold her off. He couldn't cross the distance between this part of the facility and get to Kai in time before falling flat on his face and dying of blood loss. If this were to be his last stand, then so be it. Just as he was about to reload his revolver, the bands on Eri's arms began to glow a bright red. A yellow aura surrounded Eri, as her movements, still slowed, mind you, began to speed up. It got to the point where she was moving faster than a blur, which shouldn't have been possible. Despite that, it was exactly what was happening. And after just a measly 10 seconds, just as Hari was able to fit the chamber of his revolver in place, Eri's head whipped in his direction, her teeth bare for the world to see, as she lunged forward. Swinging his only remaining arm at the same time Eri closed the distance between them, Hari was able to slam Eri into the wall. All it served to do was make the girl even angrier, a trend he was beginning to notice, as in response to that, Eri bit down on his wrist. Blood sprayed like a stream of bursting water as Hari screamed in pain. Eri didn't stop there, as not only did she bite his wrist, she was beginning to eat his wrist. In a matter of seconds, far faster than he could react to the pain, she had completely eaten off his hand. Hari couldn't stop screaming in pain. But as if that wasn't enough, at that point, Eri seemed to regain some sort of consciousness. No longer was she in a feral-like animal state. She was fully there. Her eyes looked less foggy and more clear, and with it, he had hoped for her to be horrified. But instead, there was only a great, big, smile on her face. The kind of smile that appeared when someone was beyond delighted with themselves. Big bro was right. I do feel stronger. Eri said, looking at her now claw-like hands. Big bro? Hari thought, confusion and pain washing over his face as he struggled to get up. Whatever. That didn't matter. What mattered was that he had to get up, somehow. He had to run, to warn Kai about what was happening. To have him overhaul him so he wouldn't be in pain. He didn't care about putting Eri down now. It was clear that it was impossible. Eri, somehow, was stronger than an adult human now, and it was what was allowing her to fight him head-on without caring. Somehow, her quirk had evolved to not only rewind things but fast-forward herself, and perhaps others. Somehow, Eri was able to regenerate what should have been fatal wounds all by herself. Somehow. Eri had become a monster. Either way, Eri needed to be stopped somehow, if that was even possible. Just as he had begun to rise from his fallen form, he had accidentally moved the gun, making a noise. It was then that Eri looked over at him. A scowl took up her visage as she raised her left clawed hand, and scratched open her right arm. Blood began to seep from the wound, and when it did, it began to transform into a black-tipped spear. You and the bad man wanted my blood so badly, right? Eri asked, tilting her head as her eye gained a cruel gleam. Well then, you can have it. Those were the last words Hari Kurono heard, as his head was ripped off of his shoulders by the blood arrow created by Eri. The rampage had only just begun. And Eri wasn't going to stop until everyone in the damned facility was dead. Then and only then could Eri live in peace. Gunfire and screams of pain and agony rang throughout the halls of the Shai Hasaikai headquarters. Mixed in with the screaming and the gunfire was the sound of sirens going off within the building, the security alarm, something she was familiar with. It happened when she had broken out multiple times, and she knew what would happen because of it. The power to the building had been cut off, only allowing for the low-brightness red lights to fill the halls, making the building more or less something out of one of those horror movies Big Bro liked to watch when he wasn't muttering to himself about how Uraraka-san was being squeamish over eating the people she had killed. It had been a long time since someone had been able to not only break into the headquarters of the Shai Hasaikai but in the same stroke of absolute luck do damage to the building. Most people got into the building, took down a few mooks, and then were killed by one of the bullets. Not this time, though. This time was different because the intruder had known the layout of the building. If there was one thing that Eri could thank the bad man for, it was teaching her the layout of the base back before the bad man had decided to hurt her. Blood stained the walls, with corpses of various thugs, big and small, muscular and shrimpy, littering the floor, all of which were half-eaten to some extent. Some had missing sections of their torso, others had their faces ripped off, and some straight up didn't have limbs anymore. And to think all of this carnage was caused by one little girl. Granted, that little girl wasn't a human, but still, the sentiment was the same. Eri walked down the hallway of death, arms lazily swinging from side to side as she bit into an arm she had picked up along the way. It tasted like apples, just like she wanted to be having right about now. Juicy, fresh, amazing apples. Speaking of apples, Big Bro probably can't give her apples anymore. That sucked, but then again, that meant she could actually eat with him now. So there was no real loss. Besides, if she could make this taste like apples, then what was the loss here? Up ahead, there was a thug with a missing arm she was holding, scrambling away backwards, staring up at her with terror and fear in his eyes. The way he looked like a hopeless child made her feel some sort of way, familiarity, she believed the word was. Blood seemed to endlessly pour down his wound, and with every second, his skin began to look more and more pale. Please. Espar, AGH. When Eri caught up to him, she stomped down on his chest, punching a hole through his chest and out of his back. The thug fell to the ground with a silent thud, and once again, Eri was left with the sound of the sirens blaring in her ears. They were annoying, but then again, there wasn't really anything she could do about it now, could she? A few moments later, just as Eri was about to rip the head off of the corpse that she had just made, around 10 or so other thugs entered the hallway. They were all wearing various amounts of protective gear, and they all carried some form of gun, all of them long and should have been intimidating. Keyword being, should have. But Eri was not afraid of such things anymore, seeing as they were completely useless against her. Don't let the intruder get anywhere near Overhaul. We must protect him. As soon as the thug in the center said that, they aimed their assault rifles at her. If she remembered correctly, all of the lower-level thugs in the Shai Hasaikai were curseless, quirkless, hence the guns, as a hail of gunfire spurred its way through her as she casually heeled it. She didn't care that she was being fired at. It wasn't as if she felt anything. The blood dripping from the closing wounds slowly began to pool around her, as a large, nearly twice the size of herself spear formed out of the blood. She knew it was sharp because she created it, and from it, lightning began to form around the tip, sparking every way around it. They all stopped, staring at her with wide eyes. Ah, you're done? He. Eri giggled, narrowing her eyes as she grinned. My turn. As those words left her mouth, the spear began to spark faster, taking out all of the lights and cameras near her. A sharp gleam reflected in her eye, as the name of her newfound attack came rushing out of her mouth. Blood demon art, blood manipulation, creation, spear, electric devastation. Throwing the spear toward the thugs, aiming at the ground, all of them raised an eyebrow, confusion taking up their visages. Eri then created another, threw it, then charged forward. The electricity was still building up on the ends of the spears whilst she created one more, just for good measure. They all began to fire at her again, not that mattered, as she impaled the center thug in the throat with her newly created blood-red spear. With a snap of her fingers, the spears exploded into balls of electricity, electrocuting everyone in the area where the spears had landed. Their fried corpses fell to the ground, steam rising off of them as the blood from the spears pooled toward Eri, re-entering the holes in her body as she began to heal once more. Eri was smiling ear to ear, knowing full well that was just one of the things that she could do. She had two more ideas in mind, fire and ice. The fire one, she decided, was only going to be used in times of desperation, and the ice one, well, she'd use that one next if given the chance. A groan came from her right, as she looked down at one of the thugs that she didn't kill. Somehow, he lived. She didn't know how that was possible, but it was. Maybe it was because of the rubber mask and gloves? Grabbing him by the collar of his shirt, the small child used her newfound strength to lift him into the air and forced him to stare into her eyes. He squirmed, his body shaking as the burns from the electricity on his body were bare for the world to see. "Where's Overhaul?" Eri spat, her tone blunt as the man screamed. He was terrified. Good. Unfortunately, it wasn't good for her. Nicking her free hand with her horn, she drew blood, before wiping it on his left leg. Throwing him to the ground, she balled her hand into a fist as blood on his left leg began to glow. Smirking, Eri activated another facet of her blood demon art. Blood demon art, blood manipulation, explosive blood. With a massive boom, the thug's lower body exploded into red, meaty chunks, sending the rest of him flying into the end of the hallway, splattering against the wall and turning into a red stain. As soon as that happened, a giant crystal impaled through her body, catching Eri off guard. She got so high up on the thing that she was close to the roof. Acting in the moment, she played dead, going limp as her blood cascaded down the massive crystal. Walking around, it was that Hojo guy that Toya always talked about. And speaking of him, he was there too, along with Soramitsu. Jesus Christ, Hoyo-kun. That's still the Oyabun's little girl, yeah. Fuck man, you just killed her. He's gonna kill us. Soramitsu complained, grabbing at the edges of the bag on his head, all the while Toya shrugged. Nah, 'cause the order was to kill the intruder. Seems like the little girl went on a rampage. Sides, the Oyabun can always overhaul her back to life, right? Toya began, as he went up to her, poking her face as she remained still. Still though, all that blood control stuff? You think she really was with All for One? That has to be a new quirk. Has to be, Hojo grumbled, crossing his arms. Same with that regeneration power. That must be why she came back here completely willingly, or at least without as much of a hassle. She was ready to kill everyone here, probably, 'cause of All for One. With her dead though, we can call off the alarm. Just as he said that, Eri activated yet another ability. This one, however, she came up with on the spot. It would allow her to kill them without moving a muscle, though it did cost her a lot of blood to do it. The blood on the crystal, which now coated the whole thing, began to boil and turn into vapor. As it did, the three men began to cough, covering their noses as Eri's visage twisted into a sneer. Shit, how the fuck is she still? Before Soramitsu could finish that sentence, Eri spoke. Blood demon art, blood manipulation, noxious blood. The blood vapors turned a sickly green, invading any opening on the three men. As soon as it did, their bodies began to break out into hives, and when they did, the hives popped with more toxic blood. They screamed in pain, and in the blink of an eye, their bodies turned into sludge, the only thing remaining being the clothing. Wiggling off of the giant crystal, she fell gracelessly onto the floor, face planting into the tile as she groaned. The hole in her torso began to regenerate, and it was about the size of a basketball. Deciding that this would not do, Eri yanked off her now completely ruined dress, grabbed the black shirt of the now deceased Hojo, and slipped it on. I look stupid, Eri muttered, holding up her arm as the long sleeve dwarfed her arm by a wide margin. Well, I wouldn't say stupid, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. Turning around, Eri was greeted with, "Big bro? How did he get here? And better yet, why did he look so scary?" Staring at him made her shiver. It was almost as if she was looking up at Cammy. But why? He reached out to her, ruffling her hair. You feel that, don't you? My anger, my seething rage. It is not directed toward you, but rather this overhaul person. How did you get here, big bro? Eri asked, confusion taking over her visage as Izuku smiled. When you turned, I instinctively knew where you were. Think of it like tracking a lost phone, though much more important. I was so worried about what happened to you after I heard what happened on the news. Oh, and by the way, Izumi-kun is doing just fine, as is Todoroki-san. I intervened, shall I say. They're resting in my house in the meantime, and their families are aware. You should go, too. I'll deal with this now. But. Eri began, pouting as she did so. I wanted to hurt the bad man for once. Ah, I see, Izuku said, as placed a hand on her shoulder. But as your big brother, I don't want you to get hurt. So, as your big brother, I'm asking you to go home. Okay? As Izuku said that, he frowned, cupping his chin as Eri didn't do so much as budge. Izuku knew just how much this most likely meant to Eri, but at the same time, he had an inkling that this overhaul individual was far too strong for even Eri. Izuku saw just how strong Eri was now. She was more than able to take down these thugs and lowly villains. However, there was something different about Overhaul. Assumedly, Overhaul was not a pushover, but Eri was. Eri was sloppy in how she fought. How her lunges were poorly timed. He could see just how horrible that fight would end. Izuku didn't know what Overhaul's quirk was. But, seeing as he was the head of the Shai Hasaikai, he had to assume it was something overpowered. Heads of criminal organizations tended to have that kind of power. Tell you what, Eri, Izuku began, uncrossing his arms as he leaned against the wall. I'll bring you his head. You may do with it what you wish, all right? You promise? Eri pouted as Izuku nodded. I promise. Now go home, Eri. Izuku watched as Eri walked past him, looking back once or twice, before running off in the direction of the exit. He sighed, balling his hand into a fist. He knew something like this was going to happen. He just wished it hadn't been so soon. The effects of becoming a demon were horrible on the human psyche. That's why he kind of hoped Eri would never have to use the blood that she had been given. Oh well, it's better than her being dead, Izuku thought, before looking down the hallway and frowning. He'd have to do a bit of cleanup once he was done here. Plenty of flesh for him to snack on, and keep him full for the coming weeks. When he first got here, he had taken it upon himself to pick clean a man in a white robe with equally white hair. The only thing left of him was bones. Aside from all of that, Izuku noted the layout of the building, and how it was almost like a maze. If it wasn't for his direct connection to Eri, he would have gotten lost. He'd give credit where credit was due, whoever built the compound did so wonderfully. Even though it was an underground compound, it was sturdy enough to even survive a half-hearted strike from himself when he tested the walls. Perhaps he'd make this place his new home. It was large, had a comfortable living space up above, and was a perfect place to act as his plans in secrecy. Then again, it would throw off his already stable triple life, so perhaps not. Besides, the base was all the way in Esuha, and it took him about an hour to get there via train. Besides, Muzutafu was his turf, so to speak. He couldn't let it get unruly. As he walked, he found that the winding halls of the Shai Hasaikai headquarters were long and narrow. There was nothing to really differentiate them from one another, aside from the blood splatter that Eri left in her wake. After he got past that, he was left to his own devices, aimlessly wandering about. At least, however, he had something to do, as the halls were filled to the brim with pests. His bone whips took care of them with ease. He didn't even need to remove his hands from his pockets. On his way, he had briefly demanded to know where Overhaul was. One guy pointed in the direction that he was going, and that gave him a general idea of where it was he needed to go. Seeing as that man had outlived his usefulness, he divorced his head from his shoulders. Better to leave no survivors than even one straggler. On his walk to the location that he figured was where this Overhaul individual was, he had killed a few important-looking people, seeing as they all dressed differently from the mooks he had been systematically killing. The first one was dressed in a large black yukata with a brown mask. His head came off of his shoulders faster than he could react. The next individual was some guy in a black hat and trenchcoat with an equally black mask and white eye holes. He tried aiming and firing a gun at him that fired a strange red bullet. He caught the bullet with his closest tendril, whipped it back at the guy, and watched with a slight smirk as it created a hole through his forehead and out his cranium. He barely even caught on to the fact that there was a guy on the ceiling. He had only done so when blood showered down on him, and the fact that he had just barely moved out of the way to avoid a guy with black hair and a white mask to have fallen atop of him. He was wearing a tacky fur coat over his shoulders, so perhaps his death was worth it, if not to stop people from burning their eyes on the corpse's terrible fashion sense. The final lump of human trash that he killed was a muscular-bound man with a tight-fitting black mask over his head. It kind of looked like an anteater's head, the more he thought about it. This one actually got the courtesy of being slapped and turned into a fine mist after the fact. How had he gotten stronger between this encounter and the last one he had with that demon slayer? Well, he had gone to a shot-up daycare with more than a couple of child corpses. He didn't eat those, but he did eat the heroes investigating the place, just because they all decided that it would be a good idea to attack him, assuming he was the one who caused the incident. There were 5 in total, and he picked them to the bone. That was before he turned Fuyumi Todoroki and Kota Izumi on a whim. He didn't know why he had turned those 2 into demons. Well, no, that was a lie. He turned them into demons because he knew that Eri would be sad if her 2 favorite people outside of himself were dead, and it has been because of her, as well. On the topic of those 2, though, that Kota Izumi kid. His parents were the heroes known as Water Hose. If he remembered correctly, they died a week or so ago. No, more than that, about 3 months ago. It wasn't one of his kills, nor was it one of Stain's. It was odd, because most people didn't hear about the death of heroes if it wasn't from either of them. He had actually looked into Waterhose, just in case he had missed out on something, and sighed a breath of relief when he found out they were actually regular heroes. Sure, they took a few sponsorships, but, at the end of the day, being a hero was a paid job and it provided for them. He wasn't going to judge them for doing what needed to be done to make ends meet. The female member of Waterhose had a cousin. One he knew. Shino Sasaki. And Sasaki-san was going to be quite upset if she found out that Kota was no longer a human. That meant that he would no doubt have to deal with the pussycats in the near future. Not that he minded, considering that he needed to have a lengthy word with Pixie Bob about sexually harassing minors. Izuku stopped and stared down at the final hallway that he needed to go down to reach his target. It had taken him nearly an hour to reach here, and he had hoped that Overhaul was still in there, either fearing for his life or actively doing something. If he could avoid a fight with the man, he would do so. Well, let's get this over with, Izuku muttered, sighing as he took a few steps forward. When he did, he heard the sound of glass shattering coming from the door. If that was Overhaul making his escape. Shit! Cursing under his breath, Izuku dashed forward and was immediately stopped when he heard a shrill voice come from a few feet away from him. "You're not going anywhere." A voice roared, just as he had gotten close to a door that seemed important, and it was also labeled Laboratory. A small black plush toy sat in the middle of the hallway, a few feet away from the door. The plush toy was fat, with a white mask and soulless black eyes. In the blink of an eye, a blur jumped out from the doll. In that blink of an eye, the blur was impaled by his upper right bone whip. Lo and behold, a corpse was on the other end of it. It was, yet again, a muscular man. This one had short blonde hair, and bloodshot eyes, and was wearing a gray shirt with brown suspenders. This bone whip's blade jabbed through the man's forehead, killing him instantly. Izuku was completely unamused by that little stunt. Seriously, why on earth did that guy even bother to try? Shaking off the thought, Izuku lunged toward the door and slammed it open with a single open-palmed strike. He was immediately greeted with a spiked pillar of concrete ramming through his chest, tearing through one of his lungs, causing him to sputter up a few droplets of blood. Now that was unexpected. You're the one that took Eri away from me. Izuku looked up and saw Overhaul, or at least he assumed Overhaul to be. He was of average height, with golden yellow eyes and black hair. He was pale-skinned, and he wore a green coat with what appeared to be purple feathers lining the collar. Underneath his coat was a black shirt with a white tie, and a pair of blue pants and red and black shoes. Overhaul scoffed, as the pillar broke apart, making Izuku stumble forward. "You're just a kid. You put on a good show, I'll give you that. I have no idea how you made it this far, but judging by my dead overseer, I'm going to assume that everyone is dead. You put up a good fight, and you're completely unscathed," Overhaul stated, approaching Izuku. He noticed that his right hand was bare, while his left wasn't, as it had a white glove on it. For some reason or another, that rang alarms in Izuku's head. That had to mean something, and it wasn't anything good. "I would commend you, but you've destroyed my livelihood. The only step now is that I kill you, take back Eri, and rebuild. So do me a favor, and die." As he said that, he got close, about a handful of inches in front of Izuku, raised his hand, and slammed it down. And then, Izuku blew himself apart into chunks. Overhaul blinked, before turning around as Izuku rebuilt himself piece by piece in a matter of seconds, free from his single wound inflicted upon by Overhaul, which had already been regenerating, but he decided to intimidate the guy while he was at it. What the? Izuku snorted, holding back a laugh as smirked. "No. I think you need to do me a favor and die." As soon as those words escaped his lips, Izuku transformed his right arm into a massive fleshy blade with a dozen eyes and elongated it to pierce Overhaul through the brain. He called this move, Blood Demon Art, Biokinesis, Flesh Sword, Single Strike. Blood sprayed out from the wound as the tip of the blade exited the back of Overhaul's head, the sound of blood dripping to the ground echoing throughout the empty building. Izuku's smirk transformed into a disappointed frown. For someone who was most likely feared, why was he so weak? He still didn't know anything about the man's quirk, not that mattered, but still, and for what? For it all to be squandered because he was a human. He knew that humanity was inherently weaker than demon kind, but even still, if the history books were to be believed, and if his former self's memories were also to be believed, how the hell did the demons ever lose against humanity? What had happened to cause this? What was it that allowed humanity to persevere? Or perhaps it was a lack of acting on the demon's part. Either way, it hardly mattered. What was done, and yet again, he proved to himself that humans truly were pathetic. He stared at Overhaul's corpse, looked into its lifeless eyes, and tilted his head. For someone such as yourself, I would have thought you more imposing, and maybe more of a challenge. Then again, what was I supposed to think? I guess I keep putting too much stake in humans. His arm transformed back to normal, as Overhaul's corpse fell to the floor. Walking over to it, Izuku knelt and grabbed onto the man's temple. Just as he promised, Izuku ripped Overhaul's head off of his shoulders, before standing up and turning around. There, he saw a burlap sack filled with blood vials. Most likely, they were filled with Aries' blood before her demonic transformation. Walking over to the bag, Izuku dumped the blood vials out of the bag, shattering them in the process, before placing the head inside the bag and tying it up. Slinging it over his shoulder, Izuku walked out of the lab, stared down the bloodied hallway, and huffed. Now to get out here, this should be fun. So, he's dead. That's a shame, an old man murmured, crossing his arms as he sat on his back patio. And you believe it to be this? Hero Cannibal's fault, correct? The old man asked as Nedzu nodded. Correct, Fujiwara-san. However, we are unable to locate this hero cannibal. And, as I previously mentioned, if what he said is to be believed, then this hero cannibal is a demon, Nedzu continued, putting his paws behind his back. You know how I'm not a fan of humanity, especially after all they had done to me. But in the same breath, I am smart enough to know that a demon-run society wouldn't exactly be the best. Fujiwara hummed, closing his eyes as he stroked his long white beard. So what is it that you want me to do? The Demon Slayer Corp has been disbanded for decades. The families who used breathing styles have all but forgotten, with the Jairus being the only exception. Not to mention that the last known Tomioka descendant is that of the hero killer Stain. I am afraid of introducing new talent into the Corps, only to watch them die. These demons are immune to the sun, their former nemesis. While the blades will still kill them, I fear that with society being so dependent on quirks, these new, stronger, more powerful demons will surely use that to their advantage. That, and I doubt the students will take it seriously. Nedzu hummed in acknowledgement. He knew just how rash the younger generation of humans could be. He had seen it firsthand. The soon-to-be second years had been talking non-stop about how, once they go pro, they'll take down the hero cannibal if they aren't already dealt with when the time comes. Humans were always so cocky like that. He never truly understood why. The Chimera smirked. Then perhaps, we expose them to what demons can truly be. If I remember correctly, we have camera footage of a demon with string-like abilities mowing her way through a horde of Yakuza in a warehouse hideout, don't we? We can show off this demon's abilities and the fact that they can only be killed a certain way. Ah, so you wish for me to teach at UA, don't you? Fujiwara asked as Nedzu nodded. Seeing as you're the descendant of Kariya Ubuyashiki, I'd like to think that you'd be perfect for the role, don't you think? Besides, with Jairu Kyoka going to the school, I think that she can convince those who wouldn't normally be convinced. That, and you're a pro-hero, Fujiwara-san, or should I call you Yorai Musha? The man opened his black and orange eyes, as a small smile came across his bearded face. Please, call me Fujiwara while we're at my home, Nedzu-san, Fujiwara said, as he looked out at his flower field. He had inherited it from his late grandfather. His son and daughter were currently keeping it fresh and green while he was off at work. Currently, they were at school, finishing their studies. One wished to become a doctor, while the other wished to become a police officer. Neither wanted to be a hero, not that he cared. Kadoka Fujiwara was more than proud of them as is. And with his family's quirk being basically useless for combat, that being enhanced eyesight, it made little sense for anyone other than him to be a hero. After all, it was only because of his use of moon breathing and total concentration breathing, constant, that made him a good hero. He was able to access the old scrolls of which each breathing technique was written down, seeing as Yashiro had made copies of the scrolls should something bad happen to them. After all, he had to make up for being quirkless somehow, and so that was how he did it. So then, you agree to come work at UA? Nedzu asked as Fujiwara nodded. That I will. Let me know when I should arrive tomorrow, and we can get to work. I'm going to need more than a classroom to teach these children the way of the Demon Slayer. As Fujiwara said that, Nedzu smiled. Very well. I am glad this came to an agreeable resolution. Now, remember, 7 a.m., sharp, if you will. I was originally thinking of 5 a.m., but given your old age, I think it would be better if I pushed it back by an hour. Not only that, but your profession as a pro hero should also be considered. Do you think you can juggle both? Nedzu asked as Fujiwara frowned. Most likely not. I am getting up there in age. I turn 62 next week. Perhaps I should retire. Besides, I would become only a hindrance on the battlefield. With my knowledge and experience, I think I can be of great help. I'll announce my retirement tomorrow at 6 a.m., and then, I will be there, Fujiwara stated as Nedzu nodded, before turning to leave. Before he did, however, Fujiwara stood up and placed a hand on the chimera. Before you go, Nedzu-san. I want to know, do you have an idea of who this hero cannibal is? Could we already know about them? Fujiwara asked as Nedzu shook his head. I have a theory, but I don't have any substantial proof to back it up. Only hearsay. But I can assure you, once I have definitive proof, I will let you know, Fujiwara-san, Nedzu replied, before exiting the garden through an open door. Fujiwara stood there, hands behind his back as he sighed. Looking over his shoulder, he gazed out toward the garden, closed his eyes, then nodded to himself. He was making the right choice. He had hoped that he didn't have to reopen the Demon Slayer Corp, but it seemed as if his great-grandfather's hopes and dreams to never have to worry about the demonic scourge that plagued Japan all those years ago, was nothing but false hope. He had remembered the last recorded words of the Demon King before he perished at the hands of Tanjiro Kamado. It seemed as if he was right. Fujiwara chuckled, bowing his head as he spoke. You can't kill a force of nature, it will always return, and it will return with a vengeance. Fujiwara looked back at the doorway to his home, before smiling. My will is ironclad, you say? No matter the era, I will return, you told us. It seems as if you were right, Muzan. But the question is, will we be able to kill you once again? Fujiwara entered his home, closed the door, and decided that he was going to take a nap. Tomorrow was going to be a long day, and he was going to need all of the rest that he could get. After all, dealing with his children wore him out, and there were only 2 of them. He was going to have to deal with 20. Maybe he might have made a slight mistake taking up Nedzu's offer. I hope you enjoyed. Please like, subscribe and support the original writer.